David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Preface to the 1850 edition. I do not find it easy to get sufficiently far away from this book in the first sensations of having finished it to refer to it with the composure which this formal heading would seem to require. My interest in it is so recent and strong, and my mind is so divided between pleasure and regret, pleasure in the achievement of a long design, regret in the separation from many companions, that I am in danger of wearying the reader whom I love with personal confidences and private emotions, besides which all that I could say of the story to any purpose I have endeavored to say in it. It would concern the reader little, perhaps, to know how sorrowfully the pen is laid down at the close of a 2 years' imaginative task, or how an author feels as if he were dismissing some portion of himself into the shadowy world, when a crowd of the creatures of his brain are going from him forever. Yet I have nothing else to tell, unless, indeed, I were to confess, which might be of less moment still, that no one can ever believe this narrative in the reading more than I have believed it in the writing. Instead of looking back, therefore, I will look forward. I cannot close this volume more agreeably to myself than with a hopeful glance towards the time when I shall again put forth my 2 green leaves once a month, and with a faithful remembrance of the genial sun and showers that have fallen on these leaves of David Copperfield and made me happy. London, October 1850. Preface to the Charles Dickens edition. I remarked in the original preface to this book that I did not find it easy to get sufficiently far away from it in the first sensations of having finished it to refer to it with the composure which this formal heading would seem to require. My interest in it was so recent and strong, and my mind was so divided between pleasure and regret, pleasure in the achievement of a long design, regret in the separation from many companions, that I was in danger of wearying the reader with personal confidences and private emotions. Besides which, all that I could have said of the story to any purpose I had endeavored to say in it. It would concern the reader little, perhaps, to know how sorrowfully the pen is laid down at the close of a 2 years' imaginative task, or how an author feels as if he were dismissing some portion of himself into the shadowy world, when a crowd of the creatures of his brain are going from him forever. Yet I had nothing else to tell, unless indeed I were to confess, which might be of less moment still, that no one can ever believe this narrative in the reading more than I believed in it in the writing. So true are these avowals at the present day that I can now only take the reader into one confidence more. Of all my books, I like this the best. It will be easily believed that I am a fond parent to every child of my fancy, and that no one can ever love that family as dearly as I love them. But, like many fond parents, I have in my heart of hearts a favorite child, and his name is David Copperfield. Charles Dickens, 1869. The end of the preface to David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, read by Rick Kistner, for Lit to Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. The personal history and experience of David Copperfield the Younger. Chapter 1. I am born. Whether I shall turn out to be the hero of my own life, or whether that station will be held by anybody else, these pages must show. To begin my life with the beginning of my life, I record that I was born, as I have been informed and believe, on a Friday at 12 o'clock at night. It was remarked that the clock began to strike, and I began to cry simultaneously. In consideration of the day and hour of my birth, it was declared by the nurse and by some sage women in the neighborhood who had taken a lively interest in me several months before there was any possibility of our becoming personally acquainted, first, that I was destined to be unlucky in life, and secondly, that I was privileged to see ghosts and spirits, both these gifts inevitably attaching, as they believed, to all unlucky infants of either gender born towards the small hours on a Friday night. I need say nothing here on the first head, because nothing can show better than my history whether that prediction was verified or falsified by the result. On the second branch of the question, I will only remark that unless I ran through that part of my inheritance while I was still a baby, I have not come into it yet. But I do not at all complain of having been kept out of this property, and if anybody else should be in the present enjoyment of it, he is heartily welcome to keep it. I was born with a caul, which was advertised for sale in the newspapers at the low price of 15 guineas. Whether sea-going people were short of money about that time, or were short of faith and preferred cork jackets, I don't know. All I know is that there was but one solitary bidding, and that was from an attorney connected to the bill-broking business, who offered £2 in cash and the balance in sherry, but declined to be guaranteed from drowning on any higher bargain. Consequently, the advertisement was withdrawn at a dead loss, for as to sherry, my poor dear mother's own sherry was in the market then, and 10 years afterwards the call was put up in a raffle down in our part of the country to 50 members at half a crown a head, the winner to spend 5 shillings. I was present myself, and I remember to have felt quite uncomfortable and confused at a part of myself being disposed of in that way. The call was won, I recollect, by an old lady with a hand-basket, who very reluctantly produced from it the stipulated 5 shillings, all in halfpence and 2pence, halfpenny short, as it took an immense time and a great waste of arithmetic to endeavour without any effect to prove to her. It is a fact, which will be long remembered as remarkable down there, that she was never drowned, but died triumphantly in bed at 92. I have understood that it was, to the last, her proudest boast that she never had been on the water in her life, except upon a bridge, and that over her tea, to which she was extremely partial, she, to the last, expressed her indignation at the impiety of mariners and others, who had the presumption to go meandering about the world. It was in vain to represent to her that some conveniences, tea perhaps included, resulted from this objectionable practice. She always returned with greater emphasis, and with an instinctive knowledge of the strength of her objection, "Let us have no meandering." Not to meander myself. At present I will go back to my birth. I was born at Blunderston, in Suffolk, or thereby, as they say in Scotland. I was a posthumous child. My father's eyes had closed upon the light of this world 6 months when mine opened on it. There is something strange to me even now in the reflection that he never saw me, and something stronger yet in the shadowy remembrance that I have of my first childish associations with his white gravestone in the churchyard, and of the indefinable compassion I used to feel for it lying out alone there in the dark night, when our little parlour was warm and bright with fire and candle, and the doors of our house were, almost cruelly it seemed to me, sometimes, bolted and locked against it. An aunt of my father's, and consequently a great-aunt of mine, of whom I shall have more to relate by and by, was the principal magnate of our family. Miss Trotwood, or Miss Betsy, as my poor mother always called her, when she sufficiently overcame her dread of this formidable personage to mention her at all, which was seldom, had been married to a husband younger than herself, who was very handsome, except in the sense of the homely adage, "Handsome is that handsome does," for he was strongly suspected of having beaten Miss Betsy, and even of having once, on a disputed question of supplies, made some hasty but determined arrangements to throw her out of a 2-pair-of-stairs window. These evidences of an incompatibility of temper induced Miss Betsy to pay him off, and effect a separation by mutual consent. He went to India with his capital, and there, according to a wild legend in our family, he was once seen riding on an elephant in company with a baboon. But I think it must have been a baboo, or a begum. Anyhow, from India tidings of his death reached home within 10 years. How they affected my aunt nobody knew, for immediately upon the separation she took her maiden name again, bought a cottage in a hamlet on the sea-coast a long way off, established herself there as a single woman with one servant, and was understood to live secluded ever afterwards in an inflexible retirement. My father had once been a favourite of hers, I believe, but she was mortally affronted by his marriage, on the ground that my mother was a wax doll. She had never seen my mother, but she knew her to be not yet 20. My father and Miss Betsy never met again. He was double my mother's age when he married, and of but a delicate constitution. He died a year afterwards, and, as I have said, 6 months before I came into the world. This was the state of matters on the afternoon of what I may be excused for calling that eventful and important Friday. I can make no claim, therefore, to have known at that time how matters stood, or to have any remembrance, founded on the evidence of my own senses, of what follows. My mother was sitting by the fire, but poorly in health, and very low in spirits, looking at it through her tears, and desponding heavily about herself and the fatherless little stranger who was already welcomed by some grocers of prophetic pins in a drawer upstairs to a world not at all excited on the subject of his arrival. My mother, I say, was sitting by the fire that bright, windy March afternoon, very timid and sad, and very doubtful of ever coming alive out of the trial that was before her, when, lifting her eyes as she dried them to the window opposite, she saw a strange lady coming up the garden. My mother had a sure foreboding at that second glance that it was Miss Betsy. The setting sun was glowing on the strange lady over the garden fence, and she came walking up to the door with a fell rigidity of figure and composure of countenance that could have belonged to nobody else. When she reached the house, she gave another proof of her identity. My father had often hinted that she seldom conducted herself like any ordinary Christian, and now, instead of ringing the bell, she came and looked in at that identical window, pressing the end of her nose against the glass to that extent that my poor dear mother used to say it became perfectly flat and white in a moment. She gave my mother such a turn that I have always been convinced I am indebted to Miss Betsy for having been born on a Friday. My mother had left her chair in her agitation and gone behind it in the corner. Miss Betsy, looking around the room slowly and inquiringly, began on the other side, and carried her eyes on, like a Saracen's head in a Dutch clock, until they reached my mother. Then she made a frown and a gesture to my mother, like one who was accustomed to be obeyed, to come and open the door. My mother went. "Mrs. David Copperfield, I think," said Miss Betsy, the emphasis referring perhaps to my mother's mourning weeds and her condition. "Yes," said my mother faintly. "Miss Trotwood," said the visitor. "You have heard of her, I dare say?" My mother answered she had had that pleasure, and she had a disagreeable consciousness of not appearing to imply that it had been an overpowering pleasure. "Now you see her," said Miss Betsy. My mother bent her head and begged her to walk in. They went into the parlour my mother had come from, the fire in the best room on the other side of the passage not being lighted, not having been lighted indeed since my father's funeral, and when they were both seated, and Miss Betsy said nothing, my mother, after vainly trying to restrain herself, began to cry. "Oh, tut, tut, tut," said Miss Betsy in a hurry. "Don't do that. Come, come." My mother couldn't help it, notwithstanding, so she cried until she had had her cry out. "Take off your cap, child," said Miss Betsy, "and let me see you." My mother was too much afraid of her to refuse compliance with this odd request if she had any disposition to do so. Therefore, she did as she was told, and did it with such nervous hands that her hair, which was luxuriant and beautiful, fell all about her face. "Why, bless my heart," exclaimed Miss Betsy, "you are a very baby." My mother was, no doubt, unusually youthful in appearance even for her years. She hung her head as if it were her fault, poor thing, and said, sobbing, that indeed she was afraid she was but a childish widow, and would be but a childish mother if she lived. In a short pause which ensued, she had a fancy that she felt Miss Betsy touch her hair, and that with no ungentle hand. But, looking at her, in her timid hope, she found that lady sitting with the skirt of her dress tucked up, her hands folded on one knee, and her feet upon the fender, frowning at the fire. "In the name of heaven," said Miss Betsy suddenly, "why rookery?" "Do you mean the house, ma'am?" asked my mother. "Why rookery?" said Miss Betsy. "Cookery would have been more to the purpose, if you had had any practical ideas of life, either of you." "The name was Mr. Copperfield's choice," returned my mother. "When he bought the house, he liked to think that there were rooks about it." The evening wind made such a disturbance just now among some tall old elm trees at the bottom of the garden that neither my mother nor Miss Betsy could forbear glancing that way. As the elms bent to one another like giants who were whispering secrets, and after a few seconds of such repose fell into a violent flurry, tossing their wild arms about as if their late confidences were really too wicked for their peace of mind, some weather-beaten ragged old rooks' nests, burdening their higher branches, swung like wrecks upon a stormy sea. "Where are the birds?" asked Miss Betsy. My mother had been thinking of something else. "The rooks. What has become of them?" asked Miss Betsy. "There have not been any since we have lived here," said my mother. Mr. Copperfield thought it was quite a large rookery, but the nests were very old ones, and the birds have deserted them a long while." "David Copperfield all over," cried Miss Betsy. "David Copperfield from head to foot calls a house a rookery when there's not a rook near it, and takes the birds on trust because he sees the nests." "Mr. Copperfield," returned my mother, "is dead, and if you dare to speak unkindly of him to me—" My poor dear mother, I suppose, had some momentary intention of committing an assault and battery upon my aunt, who could easily have settled her with one hand, even if my mother had been in a far better training for such an encounter than she was that evening. But it passed with the action of rising from her chair, and she sat down again very meekly, and fainted. When she came to herself, or when Miss Betsy had restored her, whichever it was, she found the latter standing at the window. The twilight was by this time shading down into darkness, and dimly as they saw each other, they could not have done that without the aid of the fire. "Well," said Miss Betsy, coming back to her chair, as if she had only been taking a casual look at the prospect, "and when do you expect—" "I am all in a tremble," faltered my mother. "I don't know what's the matter. I shall die, I am sure." "No, no, no," said Miss Betsy. "Have some tea." "Oh, dear me, do you think it will do me any good?" cried my mother in a helpless manner. "Of course it will," said Miss Betsy. "It's nothing but fancy. What do you call your girl?" "I don't know that it will be a girl yet, ma'am," said my mother innocently. "Oh, bless the baby!" exclaimed Miss Betsy, unconsciously quoting the second sentiment of the pincushion in the drawer upstairs, but applying it to my mother instead of me. "I don't mean that. I mean your servant girl." "Peggotty," said my mother. "Peggotty?" repeated Miss Betsy with some indignation. "Do you mean to say, child, that any human being has gone into a Christian church and got herself named Peggotty?" "It's her surname," said my mother faintly. "Mr. Copperfield called her by it because her Christian name was the same as mine." "Here, Peggotty!" cried Miss Betsy, opening the parlour door. "Tea! Your mistress is a little unwell. Don't dawdle." Having issued this mandate with as much potentiality as if she had been a recognized authority in the house ever since it had been a house, and having looked out to confront the amazed Peggotty coming along the passage with a candle at the sound of a strange voice, Miss Betsy shut the door again, and sat down as before, with her feet on the fender, the skirt of her dress tucked up, and her hands folded on one knee. "You were speaking about its being a girl," said Miss Betsy. "I have no doubt it will be a girl. I have a presentiment that it must be a girl. Now, child, from the moment of the birth of this girl—" "Perhaps boy," my mother took the liberty of putting in. "I tell you I have a presentiment that it must be a girl," returned Miss Betsy. "Don't contradict. From the moment of this girl's birth, child, I intend to be her friend. I intend to be her godmother, and I beg you'll call her Betsy Trotwood Copperfield. There must be no mistakes in life with this Betsy Trotwood. There must be no trifling with her affections, poor dear. She must be well brought up and well guarded from reposing any foolish confidences where they are not deserved. I must make that my care." There was a twitch of Miss Betsy's head after each of these sentences, as if her own old wrongs were working within her, and she repressed any plainer reference to them by strong constraint. So my mother suspected at least, as she observed her by the low glimmer of the fire, too much scared by Miss Betsy, too uneasy in herself, and too subdued and bewildered altogether to observe anything very clearly or to know what to say. "And was David good to you, child?" asked Miss Betsy, when she had been silent for a little while, and these motions of her head had gradually ceased. "Were you comfortable together?" "We were very happy," said my mother. "Mr. Copperfield was only too good to me." "What? He spoilt you, I suppose?" returned Miss Betsy. "For being quite alone and dependent on myself in this rough world. Again, yes, I fear he did indeed," sobbed my mother. "Well, don't cry," said Miss Betsy. "You were not equally matched, child, if any two people can be equally matched, and so I asked the question. You were an orphan, weren't you?" "Yes." "And a governess?" "I was nursery governess in a family where Mr. Copperfield came to visit. Mr. Copperfield was very kind to me, and took a great deal of notice of me, and paid me a good deal of attention, and at last proposed to me. And I accepted him, and so we were married," said my mother simply. "Ha! Poor baby," mused Miss Betsy, with her frown still bent upon the fire. "Do you know anything?" "I beg your pardon, ma'am," faltered my mother. "About keeping house, for instance," said Miss Betsy. "Not much, I fear," returned my mother. "Not so much as I could wish. But Mr. Copperfield was teaching me." "Much he knew about it himself," said Miss Betsy in a parenthesis. "And I hope I should have improved, being very anxious to learn, and he very patient to teach me, if the great misfortune of his death—" My mother broke down again here, and could get no further. "Well, well," said Miss Betsy. "I kept my housekeeping book regularly, and balanced it with Mr. Copperfield every night," cried my mother, in another burst of distress, and breaking down again. "Well, well," said Miss Betsy, "don't cry any more." "And I am sure we never had a word of difference respecting it, except when Mr. Copperfield objected to my 3s and 5s being too much like each other, or to my putting curly tails to my 7s and 9s, resumed my mother in another burst, and breaking down again. "You'll make yourself ill," said Miss Betsy, "and you know that will not be a good either for you or my goddaughter. Come, you mustn't do it." This argument had some share in quieting my mother, though her increasing indisposition had a larger one. There was an interval of silence, only broken by Miss Betsy's occasionally ejaculating, "Ha!" as she sat with her feet upon the fender. "David had bought an annuity for himself with his money, I know," said she, by and by. "What did he do for you?" "Mr. Copperfield," said my mother, answering with some difficulty, "was so considerate and good as to secure the reversion of a part of it to me." "How much?" asked Miss Betsy. £105 a year," said my mother. "He might have done worse," said my aunt. The word was appropriate to the moment. My mother was so much worse than Peggotty, coming in with the tea-board and candles, and seeing at a glance how ill she was, as Miss Betsy might have done sooner if there had been light enough, conveyed her upstairs to her own room with all speed, and immediately dispatched Ham Peggotty, her nephew, who had been for some days past secreted in the house, unknown to my mother, as a special messenger in case of emergency, to fetch the nurse and doctor. Those allied powers were considerably astonished when they arrived within a few minutes of each other to find an unknown lady of portentous appearance sitting before the fire, with a bonnet tied over her left arm, stopping her ears with jeweller's cotton. Peggotty, knowing nothing about her, and my mother saying nothing about her, she was quite a mystery in the parlour, and the fact of her having a magazine of jeweller's cotton in her pocket and sticking the article in her ears in that way did not detract from the solemnity of her presence. The doctor, having been upstairs and come down again, and having satisfied himself, I suppose, that there was a probability of this unknown lady and himself having to sit there face to face for some hours, laid himself out to be polite and social. He was the meekest of his sex, the mildest of little men. He sidled in and out of a room to take up the less space. He walked as softly as the ghost in Hamlet, and more slowly. He carried his head on one side, partly in modest depreciation of himself, partly in modest propitiation of everybody else. It is nothing to say that he hadn't a word to throw at a dog. He couldn't have thrown a word at a mad dog. He might have offered him one gently, or half a one, or a fragment of one, for he spoke as slowly as he walked. But he wouldn't have been rude to him, and he couldn't have been quick with him for any earthly consideration. Mr. Chillip, looking mildly at my aunt with his head on one side, and making her a little bow, said in allusion to the jeweller's cotton, as he softly touched his left ear, "Some local irritation, ma'am." "What?" replied my aunt, pulling the cotton out of one ear like a cork. Mr. Chillip was so alarmed by her abruptness, as he told my mother afterwards, that it was a mercy he didn't lose his presence of mind, but he repeated sweetly, "Some local irritation, ma'am." "Nonsense," replied my aunt, and corked herself again at one blow. Mr. Chillip could do nothing after this, but sit and look at her feebly as she sat and looked at the fire, until he was called upstairs again. After some quarter of an hour's absence, he returned. "Well," said my aunt, taking the cotton out of the ear nearest to him. "Well, ma'am," returned Mr. Chillip, we are progressing slowly, ma'am." "Oh," said my aunt, with a perfect shake on the contemptuous interjection, and corked herself as before. Really, as Mr. Chillip took my mother, he was almost shocked. Speaking in a professional point of view alone, he was almost shocked. But he sat and looked at her, notwithstanding, for nearly 2 hours as she sat looking at the fire, until he was again called out. After another absence, he again returned. "Well," said my aunt, taking out the cotton on that side again. "Well, ma'am," returned Mr. Chillip, we are progressing slowly, ma'am." "Oh," said my aunt, with such a snarl at him that Mr. Chillip absolutely could not bear it. It was really calculated to break his spirit, he said afterwards. He preferred to go and sit upon the stairs in the dark and a strong draught, until he was again sent for. Ham Peggotty, who went to the National School and was a very dragon at his catechism, and who may therefore be regarded as a credible witness, reported next day that, happening to peep in at the parlour door an hour after this, he was instantly descried by Miss Betsy, then walking to and fro in a state of agitation, and pounced upon before he could make his escape. That there were now occasional sounds of feet and voices overhead, which he inferred the cotton did not exclude, from the circumstance of his evidently being clutched by the lady as a victim on whom to expend her superabundant agitation when the sounds were loudest. That, marching him constantly up and down by the collar, as if he had been taking too much laudanum, she at those times shook him, rumpled his hair, made light of his linen, stopped his ears, as if she confounded them with her own, and otherwise tussled and maltreated him. This was in part confirmed by his aunt, who saw him at 12:30 soon after his release, and affirmed that he was then as red as I was. The mild Mr. Chillip could not possibly bear malice at such a time, if at any time. He sidled into the parlour as soon as he was at liberty, and said to my aunt in his meekest manner, "Well, ma'am, I am happy to congratulate you." "What upon?" said my aunt sharply. Mr. Chillip was fluttered again by the extreme severity of my aunt's manner, so he made her a little bow and gave her a little smile to mollify her. "Mercy on the man, what's he doing?" cried my aunt impatiently. "Can't he speak?" "Be calm, my dear ma'am," said Mr. Chillip in his softest accents. "There is no longer any occasion for uneasiness, ma'am. Be calm." It has since been considered almost a miracle that my aunt didn't shake him, and shake what he had to say out of him. She only shook her own head at him, but in a way that made him quail. "Well, ma'am," resumed Mr. Chillip as soon as he had courage, "I am happy to congratulate you. All is now over, ma'am, and well over." During the 5 minutes or so that Mr. Chillip devoted to the delivery of this oration, my aunt eyed him narrowly. "How is she?" said my aunt, folding her arms with her bonnet still tied on one of them. "Well, ma'am, she will soon be quite comfortable, I hope," returned Mr. Chillip. "Quite as comfortable as we can expect a young mother to be under these melancholy domestic circumstances. There cannot be any objection to your seeing her presently, ma'am. It may do her good." "And she? How is she?" said my aunt sharply. Mr. Chillip laid his head a little more on one side, and looked at my aunt like an amiable bird. "The baby," said my aunt. "How is she?" "Ma'am," returned Mr. Chillip, "I apprehended you had known. It's a boy." My aunt said never a word, but took her bonnet by the strings in the manner of a sling, aimed a blow at Mr. Chillip's head with it, put it on bent, walked out, and never came back. She vanished like a discontented fairy, or like one of those supernatural beings whom it was popularly supposed I was entitled to see, and never came back any more. No, I lay in my basket, and my mother lay in her bed. But Betsy Trotwood Copperfield was forever in the land of dreams and shadows, the tremendous region whence I had so lately travelled, and the light upon the window of our room shone out upon the earthly bourne of all such travellers, and the mound above the ashes and the dust that once was he, without whom I had never been. The end of Chapter 1 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Read by Rick Kishner for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 2. I Observe. The first objects that assume a distinct presence before me as I look far back into the blank of my infancy are my mother, with her pretty hair and youthful shape, and Peggotty, with no shape at all, and eyes so dark that they seemed to darken their whole neighbourhood in her face, and cheeks and arms so hard and red that I wondered the birds didn't peck her in preference to apples. I believe I can remember these two at a little distance apart, dwarfed to my sight by stooping down or kneeling on the floor, and I going unsteadily from the one to the other. I have an impression on my mind which I cannot distinguish from actual remembrance of the touch of Peggotty's forefinger as she used to hold it out to me, and of its being roughened by needlework, like a pocket nutmeg grater. This may be fancy, though I think the memory of most of us can go farther back into such times than many of us suppose, just as I believe the power of observation in numbers of very young children to be quite wonderful for its closeness and accuracy. Indeed, I think that most grown men who are remarkable in this respect may with greater propriety be said not to have lost the faculty than to have acquired it, the rather as I generally observe such men to retain a certain freshness, and gentleness, and capacity of being pleased, which are also an inheritance they have preserved from their childhood. I might have a misgiving that I am meandering in stopping to say this, but that it brings me to a remark that I build these conclusions in part upon my own experience of myself, and if it should appear from anything I may set down in this narrative that I was a child of close observation, or that, as a man, I have a strong memory of my childhood, I undoubtedly lay claim to both of these characteristics. Looking back, as I was saying, into the blank of my infancy, the first objects I can remember as standing out by themselves from a confusion of things are my mother and Peggotty. What else do I remember? Let me see. There comes out of the cloud our house, not new to me, but quite familiar in its earliest remembrance. On the ground floor is Peggotty's kitchen, opening into a backyard, with a pigeon-house on a pole in the centre without any pigeons in it, a great dog-kennel in a corner without any dog, and a quantity of fowls that look terribly tall to me, walking about in a menacing and ferocious manner. There is one cock who gets upon a post to crow, and seems to take particular notice of me as I look at him through the kitchen window, who makes me shiver, he is so fierce. Of the geese outside the side gate, who come waddling after me with their long necks stretched out when I go that way, I dream at night, as a man environed by wild beasts might dream of lions. Here is a long passage. What an enormous perspective I make of it, leading from Peggotty's kitchen to the front door. A dark storeroom opens out of it, and that is the place to be run past at night, for I don't know what may be among those tubs and jars and old tea-chests when there is nobody in there with a dimly burning light letting a mouldy air come out of the door, in which there is the smell of soap, pickles, pepper, candles, and coffee, all at one whiff. Then there are the two parlours. The parlour in which we sit of an evening, my mother and I and Peggotty, for Peggotty is quite our companion when her work is done and we are alone, and the best parlour where we sit on a Sunday, grandly, but not so comfortably. There is something of a doleful air about that room to me, for Peggotty has told me, I don't know when, but apparently ages ago, about my father's funeral, and the company having their black cloaks put on. One Sunday night my mother reads to Peggotty and me in there how Lazarus was raised up from the dead, and I am so frightened that they are afterwards obliged to take me out of bed and show me the quiet churchyard out of the bedroom window, with the dead all lying in their graves at rest below the solemn moon. There is nothing half so green that I know anywhere as the grass of that churchyard, nothing half so shady as its trees, nothing half so quiet as its tombstones. The sheep are feeding there when I kneel up early in the morning in my little bed in a closet within my mother's room to look out at it, and I see the red light shining on the sundial, and I think within myself, is the sundial glad, I wonder, that it can tell the time again? Here is our pew in the church. What a high-backed pew, with a window near it, out of which our house can be seen, and is seen many times during the morning service by Peggotty, who likes to make herself as sure as she can that it's not being robbed or is not in flames. But though Peggotty's eye wanders, she is much offended if mine does, and frowns to me as I stand upon the seat that I am to look at the clergyman. But I can't always look at him. I know him without that white thing on, and I am afraid of his wondering why I stare so, and perhaps stopping the service to inquire, and what am I to do? It's a dreadful thing to gape, but I must do something. I look at my mother, but she pretends not to see me. I look at a boy in the aisle, and he makes faces at me. I look at the sunlight coming in at the open door through the porch, and there I see a stray sheep. I don't mean a sinner, but mutton, half making up his mind to come into the church. I feel that if I looked at him any longer, I might be tempted to say something out loud, and what would become of me then? I looked up at the monumental tablets on the wall, and tried to think of Mr. Bodgers, late of this parish, and what the feelings of Mrs. Bodgers must have been when affliction, sore, long time Mr. Bodgers bore, and physicians were in vain. I wonder whether they called in Mr. Chillip, and he was in vain, and if so, how he likes to be remembered of it once a week. I look from Mr. Chillip in his Sunday neckcloth to the pulpit, and think what a good place it would be to play in, and what a castle it would make, with another boy coming up the stairs to attack it, and having the velvet cushion with the tassels thrown down on his head. In time my eyes gradually shut up, and from seeming to hear the clergyman singing a drowsy song in the heat, I hear nothing until I fall off the seat with a crash, and am taken out more dead than alive by Peggotty. And now I see the outside of our house, with the latticed bedroom windows standing open to let in the sweet-smelling air, and the ragged old rooks' nests still dangling in the elm trees at the bottom of the front garden. Now I am in the garden at the back, beyond the yard where the empty pigeon-house and dog-kennel are, a very preserve of butterflies as I remember it, with a high fence and a gate and padlock, where the fruit clusters on the trees riper and richer than fruit has ever been since in any other garden, and where my mother gathers some in a basket while I stand by, bolting furtive gooseberries and trying to look unmoved. A great wind rises, and the summer is gone in a moment. We are playing in the winter twilight, dancing about the parlour. When my mother is out of breath and rests herself in an elbow-chair, I watch her winding her bright curls around her fingers and straightening her waist, and nobody knows better than I do that she likes to look so well and is proud of being so pretty. That is among my very earliest impressions, that, and a sense that we were both a little afraid of Peggotty, and submitted ourselves in most things to her direction, were among the first opinions, if they may be so called, that I ever derived from what I saw. Peggotty and I were sitting one night by the parlour fire alone. I had been reading to Peggotty about crocodiles. I must have read very perspicuously, or the poor soul must have been deeply interested, for I remember she had a cloudy impression, after I had done, that they were a sort of vegetable. I was tired of reading and dead sleepy, but having leave as a high treat to sit up until my mother came home from spending the evening at a neighbour's, I would rather have died upon my post, of course, than have gone to bed. I had reached that stage of sleepiness when Peggotty seemed to swell and grow immensely large. I propped my eyelids open with my 2 forefingers, and looked perseveringly at her as she sat at work, at the little bit of wax candle she kept for her thread, how old it looked, being so wrinkled in all directions, at the little house with the thatched roof, where the yard measure lived, at her work-box, with a sliding lid, with a view of St. Paul's Cathedral, with a pink dome painted on the top, at the brass thimble on her finger, at herself, whom I thought lovely. I felt so sleepy that I knew if I lost sight of anything for a moment, I was gone. "Peggotty," says I suddenly, "were you ever married?" "Lord, Master Davy," replied Peggotty, "what's put marriage in your head?" She answered with such a start that it quite awoke me, and then she stopped in her work and looked at me with her needle drawn out to its thread's length. "But were you ever married, Peggotty?" says I. "You are a very handsome woman, aren't you?" I thought her in a different style from my mother, certainly, but of another school of beauty. I considered her a perfect example. There was a red velvet footstool in the best parlour, on which my mother had painted a nosegay. The groundwork of that stool and Peggotty's complexion appeared to me to be one and the same thing. The stool was smooth, and Peggotty was rough, but that made no difference. "Me handsome, Davy?" said Peggotty. "Look, no, my dear. But what put marriage in your head?" "I don't know. You mustn't marry more than one person at a time, may you, Peggotty?" "Certainly not," says Peggotty with the promptest decision. "But if you marry a person, and the person dies, why, then you may marry another person, mayn't you, Peggotty?" "You may," says Peggotty, "if you choose, my dear. That's a matter of opinion." "But what is your opinion, Peggotty?" said I. I asked her and looked curiously at her, because she looked so curiously at me. "My opinion is," said Peggotty, taking her eyes from me after a little indecision and going on with her work, "that I never was married myself, Master Davy, and that I don't expect to be. That's all I know about the subject." "You ain't cross, I suppose, Peggotty, are you?" said I, after sitting quiet for a minute. I really thought she was. She had been so short with me. But I was quite mistaken, for she laid aside her work, which was a stocking of her own, and, opening her arms wide, took my curly head within them and gave it a good squeeze. I know it was a good squeeze because, being very plump, whenever she made any little exertion after she was dressed, some of the buttons on the back of her gown flew off, and I recollect, too, bursting in the opposite side of the parlour while she was hugging me. "Now let me hear some more about the crocodils," said Peggotty, who was not quite right in the name yet, "for I aren't heard half enough." I couldn't quite understand why Peggotty looked so queer, or why she was so ready to go back to the crocodiles. However, we returned to those monsters with fresh wakefulness on my part, and we left their eggs in the sand for the sun to hatch, and we ran away from them and baffled them by constantly turning, which they were unable to do quickly on account of their unwieldy make. And we went into the water after them as natives, and put sharp pieces of timber down their throats, and in short we ran the whole crocodile gauntlet. I did, at least. But I had my doubts of Peggotty, who was thoughtfully sticking her needle into various parts of her face and arms all the time. We had exhausted the crocodiles and begun with the alligators when the garden bell rang. We went out to the door, and there was my mother, looking unusually pretty, I thought, and with her a gentleman with beautiful black hair and whiskers who had walked home with us from church last Sunday. As my mother stooped down on the threshold to take me in her arms and kiss me, the gentleman said I was a more highly privileged little fellow than a monarch, or something like that, for my later understanding comes I am sensible to my aid here. "What does that mean?" I asked him over her shoulder. He patted me on the head, but somehow I didn't like him or his deep voice, and I was jealous that his hand should touch my mother's in touching me, which it did. I put it away as well as I could. "Oh, Davy," remonstrated my mother. "Dear boy," said the gentleman, "I cannot wonder at his devotion." I never saw such a beautiful colour on my mother's face before. She gently chid me for being rude, and keeping me close to her shawl, turned to thank the gentleman for taking so much trouble as to bring her home. She put out her hand to him as she spoke, and, as he met it with his own, she glanced, I thought, at me. "Let us say good night, my fine boy," said the gentleman when he had bent his head. I saw him over my mother's little glove. "Good night," said I. "Come, let us be best friends in the world," said the gentleman, laughing. "Shake hands." My right hand was in my mother's left, so I gave him the other. "Why, that's the wrong hand, Davy," laughed the gentleman. My mother drew my right hand forward, but I was resolved, for my former reason, not to give it him, and I did not. I gave him the other, and he shook it heartily, and said I was a brave fellow, and went away. At this minute I see him turn round in the garden, and give us a last look with his ill-omened black eyes, before the door was shut. Peggotty, who had not said a word or moved a finger, secured the fastenings instantly, and we all went into the parlour. My mother, contrary to her usual habit, instead of coming to the elbow-chair by the fire, remained at the other end of the room, and sat singing to herself. "Hope you have had a pleasant evening, ma'am," said Peggotty, standing as stiff as a barrel in the centre of the room, with a candlestick in her hand. "Much obliged to you, Peggotty," returned my mother in a cheerful voice. "I had a very pleasant evening." "A stranger or so makes an agreeable change," suggested Peggotty. "A very agreeable change indeed," returned my mother. Peggotty continuing to stand motionless in the middle of the room, and my mother resuming her singing, I fell asleep, though I was not so sound asleep but that I could hear voices without hearing what they said. When I half awoke from this uncomfortable doze, I found Peggotty and my mother both in tears and both talking. "Not such a one as this Mr. Copperfield wouldn't have liked," said Peggotty. "That I say, and that I swear." "Good heavens!" cried my mother. "You'll drive me mad. Was ever any poor girl so ill-used by her servants as I am? Why, do I do myself the injustice of calling myself a girl? Have I never been married, Peggotty?" "God knows you have, ma'am," returned Peggotty. "Then how can you dare?" said my mother. "You know, I don't mean how can you dare, Peggotty, but how can you have the heart to make me so uncomfortable and say such bitter things to me when you are well aware that I haven't out of this place a single friend to turn to?" "The more's the reason," returned Peggotty, "for saying that it won't do. No, that it won't do. No, no price could make it do. No." I thought Peggotty would have thrown the candlestick away, she was so emphatic with it. "How can you be so aggravating," said my mother, shedding more tears than before, "as to talk in such an unjust manner? How can you go on as if it was all settled and arranged, Peggotty, when I tell you over and over again, you cruel thing, that beyond the commonest civilities nothing has passed? You talk of admiration. What am I to do? If people are so silly as to indulge the sentiment, is it my fault? What am I to do, I ask you? Would you wish me to shave my head and black my face, or disfigure myself with a burn or a scald, or something of that sort? I dare say you would, Peggotty. I dare say you'd quite enjoy it." Peggotty seemed to take this aspersion very much to heart, I thought. "And my dear boy," cried my mother, coming to the elbow-chair in which I was, and caressing me, "my own little Davy, is it to be hinted to me that I am wanting in affection for my precious treasure, the dearest little fellow that ever was?" "Nobody ever went and hinted no such a thing," said Peggotty. "You did, Peggotty," returned my mother. "You know you did. What else was it possible to infer from what you said, you unkind creature, when you know as well as I do that on his account only last quarter I wouldn't buy myself a new parasol, though that old green one is frayed the whole way up, and that fringe is perfectly mangy. You know it is, Peggotty. You can't deny it." Then, turning affectionately to me, with her cheek against mine, "Am I a naughty mamma to you, Davy? And am I a nasty, cruel, selfish, bad mamma? Say I am, my child. Say yes, dear boy, and Peggotty will love you, and Peggotty's love is a great deal better than mine, Davy. I don't love you at all, do I?" At this, we all fell a-crying together. I think I was the loudest of the party, but I am sure we were all sincere about it. I was quite heartbroken myself, and am afraid that in the first transports of wounded tenderness I called Peggotty a beast. That honest creature was in deep affliction, I remember, and must have become quite buttonless on the occasion, for a little volley of those explosives went off when, after having made it up with my mother, she kneeled down by the elbow-chair and made it up with me. We went to bed greatly dejected. My sobs kept waking me for a long time, and when one very strong sob quite hoisted me up in bed, I found my mother sitting on the coverlet and leaning over me. I fell asleep in her arms after that, and slept so soundly. Whether it was the following Sunday when I saw the gentleman again, or whether there was any greater lapse of time before he reappeared, I cannot recall. I don't profess to be clear about dates. But there he was, in church, and he walked home with us afterwards. He came in, too, to look at a famous geranium we had in the parlour window. It did not appear to me that he took much notice of it. But before he went, he asked my mother to give him a bit of the blossom. She begged him to choose it for himself, but he refused to do that. I could not understand why. So she plucked it for him and gave it into his hand. He said he would never part with it any more, and I thought he must be quite a fool not to know that it would fall to pieces in a day or two. Peggotty began to be less with us of an evening than she had always been. My mother deferred to her very much, more than usual it occurred to me, and we were all three excellent friends. Still, we were different from what we used to be, and were not so comfortable among ourselves. Sometimes I fancied that Peggotty perhaps objected to my mother's wearing all the pretty dresses she had in her drawers, or to her going so often to visit at that neighbour's. But I couldn't, to my satisfaction, make out how it was. Gradually, I became used to seeing the gentleman with the black whiskers. I liked him no better than at first, and had the same uneasy jealousy of him. But if I had any reason for it beyond a child's instinctive dislike and a general idea that Peggotty and I could make much of my mother without any help, it certainly was not the reason that I might have found if I had been older. No such thing came into my mind or near it. I could observe in little pieces, as it were, but as to making a net of a number of these pieces and catching anybody in it, that was as yet beyond me. One autumn morning I was with my mother in the front garden when Mr. Murdstone, I knew him by that name now, came by on horseback. He reined up his horse to salute my mother, and said he was going to Lowestoft to see some friends who were there with a yacht, and merrily proposed to take me on the saddle before him if I would like the ride. The air was so clear and pleasant, and the horse seemed to like the idea of the ride so much himself, as he stood snorting and pawing at the garden gate, that I had a great desire to go. So I was sent upstairs to Peggotty to be made spruce, and in the meantime Mr. Murdstone dismounted, and with his horse's bridle drawn over his arm, walked slowly up and down on the outer side of the sweetbrier fence, while my mother walked slowly up and down on the inner to keep him company. I recollect Peggotty and I peeping out at them from my little window. I recollect how closely they seemed to be examining the sweetbrier between them as they strolled along, and how from being in a perfectly angelic temper, Peggotty turned cross in a moment and brushed my hair the wrong way excessively hard. Mr. Murdstone and I were soon off, and trotting along on the green turf by the side of the road. He held me quite easily with one arm, and I don't think I was restless usually, but I could not make up my mind to sit in front of him without turning my head sometimes and looking up in his face. He had that kind of shallow black eye. I want a better word to express an eye that has no depth in it to be looked into, which, when it is abstracted, seems from some peculiarity of light to be disfigured, for a moment at a time, by a cast. Several times when I glanced at him, I observed that appearance with a sort of awe, and wondered what he was thinking about so closely. His hair and whiskers were blacker and thicker, looked at so near, than even I had given them credit for being. A squareness about the lower part of his face, and the dotted indication of the strong black beard he shaved close every day, reminded me of the waxwork that had travelled into our neighbourhood some half a year before. This, his regular eyebrows, and the rich white and black and brown of his complexion, confounded his complexion, and his memory made me think him, in spite of my misgivings, a very handsome man. I have no doubt that my poor dear mother thought him so too. We went to a hotel by the sea, where two gentlemen were smoking cigars in a room by themselves. Each of them was lying out on at least 4 chairs, and had a large rough jacket on. In a corner was a heap of coats and boat cloaks, and a flag, all bundled up together. They both rolled on to their feet in an untidy sort of manner when we came in, and said, "Hello, Murdstone, we thought you were dead." "Not yet," said Mr. Murdstone. "And who's this shaver?" said one of the gentlemen, taking hold of me. "That's Davy," returned Mr. Murdstone. "Davy who?" said the gentleman. "Jones?" "Copperfield," said Mr. Murdstone. "What, bewitching Mrs. Copperfield's encumbrance?" cried the gentleman. "The pretty little widow?" "Quinion," said Mr. Murdstone, Take care, if you please. Somebody's sharp." "Who is?" asked the gentleman, laughing. I looked up quickly, being curious to know. "Only Brooks of Sheffield," said Mr. Murdstone. I was quite relieved to find that it was only Brooks of Sheffield, for at first I really thought it was I. There seemed to be something very comical in the reputation of Mr. Brooks of Sheffield, for both the gentlemen laughed heartily when he was mentioned, and Mr. Murdstone was a good deal amused also. After some laughing, the gentleman whom he had called Quinion said, "And what was the opinion of Brooks of Sheffield in reference to the projected business?" "Why, I don't know that Brooks understands much about it at present," replied Mr. Murdstone, "but he is not generally favourable, I believe." There was more laughter at this, and Mr. Quinion said he would ring the bell for some sherry in which to drink to Brooks. This he did, and when the wine came, he made me have a little with a biscuit, and before I drank it, stand up and say, "Confusion to Brooks of Sheffield." The toast was received with great applause and such hearty laughter that it made me laugh too, at which they laughed the more. In short, we quite enjoyed ourselves. We walked about on the cliff after that, and sat on the grass, and looked at things through a telescope. I could make out nothing myself when it was put to my eye, but I pretended I could, and then we came back to the hotel to an early dinner. All the time we were out, the two gentlemen smoked incessantly, which I thought, if I might judge from the smell of their rough coats, they must have been doing ever since the coats had first come home from the tailor's. I must not forget that we went on aboard the yacht, where they all three descended into the cabin and were busy with some papers. I saw them quite hard at work when I looked down through the open skylight. They left me during this time with a very nice man with a very large head of red hair and a very small shiny hat upon it, who had got a cross-barred shirt of waistcoat on with Skylark in capital letters across the chest. I thought it was his name, and that, as he lived on board ship and hadn't a street door to put his name on, he put it there instead. But when I called him Mr. Skylark, he said it meant the vessel. I observed all day that Mr. Murdstone was graver and steadier than the two gentlemen. They were very gay and careless. They joked freely with one another, but seldom with him. It appeared to me that he was more clever and cold than they were, and that they regarded him with something of my own feeling. I remarked that, once or twice, when Mr. Quinion was talking, he looked at Mr. Murdstone sideways, as if to make sure of his not being displeased, and that once, when Mr. Passnage, the other gentleman, was in high spirits, he trod upon his foot, and gave him a secret caution with his eyes to observe Mr. Murdstone, who was sitting stern and silent. Nor do I recollect that Mr. Murdstone laughed at all that day, except at the Sheffield joke, and that, by the way, was his own. We went home early in the evening. It was a very fine evening, and my mother and he had another stroll by the Sweetbriar, while I was sent in to get my tea. When he was gone, my mother asked me all about the day I had had, and what they had said and done. I mentioned what they had said about her, and she laughed, and told me they were impudent fellows who talked nonsense. But I knew it pleased her. I knew it quite as well as I know it now. I took the opportunity of asking if she was at all acquainted with Mr. Brooks of Sheffield, but she answered no, only she supposed he must be a manufacturer in the knife-and-fork way. Can I say of her face, altered as I have reason to remember it, perished, as I know it is, that it is gone, when here it comes before me at this instant, as distinct as any face that I may choose to look on in a crowded street? Can I say of her innocent and girlish beauty that it faded, and was no more, when its breath falls on my cheek now as it fell that night? Can I say she ever changed when my remembrance brings her back to life, thus only, and truer to its loving youth than I have been, or man ever is still holds fast what it cherished then? I write of her just as she was when I had gone to bed after this talk, and she came to bid me good night. She kneeled down playfully by the side of the bed, and laying her chin upon her hands and laughing said, "What was it they said, Davy? Tell me again. I can't believe it." "Bewitching," I began. My mother put her hands upon my lips to stop me. "It was never bewitching," she said, laughing. "It never could have been bewitching, Davy. Now I know it wasn't." "Yes, it was. Bewitching Mrs. Copperfield," I repeated stoutly. "And pretty." "No, it was never pretty." "Not pretty," interposed my mother, laying her fingers on my lips again. "Yes, it was. Pretty little widow." "What foolish, impudent creatures," cried my mother, laughing and covering her face. "What ridiculous men, aren't they, Davy dear?" "Well, Ma, don't tell Peggotty. She might be angry with them. I am dreadfully angry with them myself, but I would rather Peggotty didn't know." I promised, of course, and we kissed one another over and over again, and I soon fell fast asleep. It seems to me at this distance of time as if it were the next day when Peggotty broached the striking and adventurous proposition I am about to mention, but it was probably about 2 months afterwards. We were sitting as before one evening, when my mother was out as before, in company with the stocking and the yard measure and the bit of wax and the box with St. Paul's on the lid and the crocodile book, when Peggotty, after looking at me several times and opening her mouth as if she were going to speak, without doing it, which I thought was merely gaping, or I should have been rather alarmed, said coaxingly, "Master Davy, how should you like to go along with me and spend a fortnight at my brother's at Yarmouth? Wouldn't that be a treat?" "Is your brother an agreeable man, Peggotty?" I inquired provisionally. "Oh, what an agreeable man he is!" cried Peggotty, holding up her hands. "Then there's the sea, and the boats and ships, and the fishermen, and the beach, and Ham to play with." Peggotty meant her nephew Ham, mentioned in my first chapter, but she spoke of him as a morsel of English grammar. I was flushed by her summary of delights, and replied that it would indeed be a treat. But what would my mother say? "Why, then I'll be as good as bet a guinea," said Peggotty, intent upon my face, "that she'll let us go. I'll ask her, if you like, as soon as ever she comes home. There, now." "But what's she to do while we're away?" said I, putting my small elbows on the table to argue the point. "She can't live by herself." If Peggotty were looking for a hole all of a sudden in the heel of that stocking, it must have been a very little one indeed, and not worth darning. "I say, Peggotty, she can't live by herself, you know." "Oh, bless you," said Peggotty, looking at me again at last. "Don't you know? She's going to stay for a fortnight with Mrs. Graper. Mrs. Graper's going to have a lot of company." Oh, if that was it, I was quite ready to go. I waited in the utmost impatience until my mother came home from Mrs. Graper's, for it was that identical neighbour, to ascertain if we could get leave to carry out this great idea. Without being nearly so much surprised as I had expected, my mother entered into it readily, and it was all arranged that night, and my board and lodging during the visit were to be paid for. The day soon came for our going. It was such an early day that it came soon, even to me, who was in a fever of expectation, and half afraid that an earthquake or a fiery mountain or some other great convulsion of nature might interpose to stop the expedition. We were to go in a carrier's cart, which departed in the morning after breakfast. I would have given any money to have been allowed to wrap myself up overnight and sleep in my hat and boots. It touches me nearly now, although I tell it lightly, to recollect how eager I was to leave my happy home, to think how little I suspected what I did leave forever. I am glad to recollect that when the carrier's cart was at the gate, and my mother stood there kissing me, a grateful fondness for her and for the old place I had never turned my back upon before made me cry. I am glad to know that my mother cried too, and that I felt her heart beat against mine. I am glad to recollect that when the carrier began to move, my mother ran out at the gate and called to him to stop, that she might kiss me once more. I am glad to dwell upon the earnestness and love with which she lifted up her face to mine, and did so. As we left her standing in the road, Mr. Murdstone came up to where she was, and seemed to expostulate with her for being so moved. I was looking back, round the awning of the cart, and wondered what business it was of his. Peggotty, who was also looking back on the other side, seemed anything but satisfied, as the face she brought back in the cart denoted. I sat looking at Peggotty for some time in a reverie on this supposititious case, whether, if she were employed to lose me like the boy in the fairy tale, I should be able to track my way back home again by the buttons she would shed. The end of Chapter 2 of David Copperfield, by Charles Dickens. Read by Rick Kishner for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. David Copperfield, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 3. I Have a Change. The carrier's horse was the laziest horse in the world, I should hope, and shuffled along with his head down, as if he liked to keep people waiting to whom the packages were directed. I fancied, indeed, that he sometimes chuckled audibly over this reflection, but the carrier said he was only troubled with a cough. The carrier had a way of keeping his head down, like his horse, and of drooping sleepily forward as he drove, with one of his arms on each of his knees. I say drove, but it struck me that the cart would have gone to Yarmouth quite as well without him, for the horse did all that, and as to conversation he had no idea of it but whistling. Peggotty had a basket of refreshments on her knee, which would have lasted us out handsomely if we had been going to London by the same conveyance. We ate a good deal and slept a good deal. Peggotty always went to sleep with her chin upon the handle of the basket, her hold of which never relaxed, and I could not have believed, unless I had heard her do it, that one defenceless woman could have snored so much. We made so many deviations up and down lanes, and were such a long time delivering a bedstead at a public-house, and calling at other places, that I was quite tired and very glad when we saw Yarmouth. It looked rather spongy and soppy, I thought, as I carried my eye over the great dull waste that lay across the river, and I could not help wondering if the world were really as round as my geography book said, how any part of it came to be so flat. But I reflected that Yarmouth might be situated at one of the poles, which would account for it. As we drew a little nearer and saw the whole adjacent prospect lying a straight low line under the sky, I hinted to Peggotty that a mound or so might have improved it, and also that if the land had been a little more separated from the sea, and the town and the tide had not been quite so much mixed up like toast and water, it would have been nicer. But Peggotty said, with greater emphasis than usual, that we must take things as we found them, and that, for her part, she was proud to call herself a Yarmouth bloater. When we got into the street, which was strange enough to me, and smelt the fish and pitch and oakum and tar, and saw the sailors walking about and the carts jingling up and down over the stones, I felt that I had done so busy a place an injustice, and said as much to Peggotty, who heard my expressions of delight with great complacency, and told me it was well known, I suppose to those who had the good fortune to be born bloaters, that Yarmouth was, upon the whole, the finest place in the universe. "Here's my am," screamed Peggotty, "growed out of knowledge." He was waiting for us, in fact, at the public-house, and asked me how I found myself, like an old acquaintance. I did not feel at first that I knew him as well as he knew me, because he had never come to our house since the night I was born, and naturally he had the advantage of me. But our intimacy was much advanced by his taking me on his back to carry me home. He was now a huge, strong fellow of 6 feet high, broad in proportion and round-shouldered, but with a simpering boy's face and curly light hair that gave him quite a sheepish look. He was dressed in a canvas jacket and a pair of such very stiff trousers that they would have stood quite as well alone without any legs in them, and you couldn't so properly have said he wore a hat as that he was covered in a top, like an old building with something pitchy. Ham carrying me on his back and a small box of ours under his arm, and Peggotty carrying another small box of ours, we turned down lanes bestrewn with bits of chips and little hillocks of sand, and went past gas-works, rope-walks, boat-builders' yards, shipwrights' yards, shipbreakers' yards, caulkers' yards, riggers' lofts, smiths' forges, and a great litter of such places, until we came out upon the dull waste I had already seen at a distance, when Ham said, "Yon's our house, Master Davy." I looked in all directions, as far as I could stare over the wilderness, and away at the sea and away at the river, but no house could I make out. There was a black barge, or some other kind of superannuated boat not far off, high and dry on the ground, with an iron funnel sticking out of it for a chimney, and smoking very cosily, but nothing else in the way of a habitation that was visible to me. "That's not it," said I, "that ship-looking thing." "That's it, Master Davy," returned Ham. If it had been Aladdin's palace, roc's egg and all, I suppose I could not have been more charmed with the romantic idea of living in it. There was a delightful door cut in the side, and it was roofed in, and there were little windows in it, but the wonderful charm of it was that it was a real boat, which had no doubt been upon the water hundreds of times, and which had never been intended to be lived in on dry land. That was the captivation of it to me. If it had ever been meant to be lived in, I might have thought it small or inconvenient or lonely, but never having been designed for any such use, it became a perfect abode. It was beautifully clean inside, and as tidy as possible. There was a table, and a Dutch clock, and a chest of drawers, and on the chest of drawers there was a tea-tray with a painting on it of a lady with a parasol taking a walk with a military-looking child who was trundling a hoop. The tray was kept from tumbling down by a Bible, and the tray, if it had tumbled down, would have smashed a quantity of cups and saucers and a teapot that were grouped around the book. On the walls there were some common-coloured pictures, framed and glazed, of scripture subjects, such as I have never seen since in the hands of pedlars, without seeing the whole interior of Peggotty's brother's house again at one view. Abraham in red, going to sacrifice Isaac in blue, and Daniel in yellow, cast into a den of green lions, were the most prominent of these. Over the little mantel-shelf was a picture of the Sarah Jane lugger built at Sunderland, with a real little wooden stern stuck onto it, a work of art combining composition with carpentry, which I considered to be one of the most enviable possessions that the world could afford. There were some hooks in the beams of the ceiling, the use of which I did not divine then, and some lockers and boxes and conveniences of that sort which served for seats and eked out the chairs. All this I saw in the first glance after I crossed the threshold, childlike, according to my theory, and then Peggotty opened a little door and showed me my bedroom. It was the completest and most desirable bedroom ever seen, in the stern of the vessel, with a little window where the rudder used to go through, a little looking-glass just the right height for me, nailed against the wall, and framed with oyster shells, a little bed which there was just room enough to get into, and a nosegay of seaweed in a blue mug on the table. The walls were whitewashed, as white as milk, and the patchwork counterpane made my eyes quite ache with its brightness. One thing I particularly noticed in this delightful house was the smell of fish, which was so searching that, when I took out my pocket handkerchief to wipe my nose, I found it smelt exactly as if it had wrapped up a lobster. On my imparting this discovery in confidence to Peggotty, she informed me that her brother dealt in lobsters, crabs, and crawfish, and I afterwards found that a heap of these creatures, in a state of wonderful conglomeration with one another, and never leaving off pinching whatever they laid hold of, were usually to be found in a little wooden outhouse where the pots and kettles were kept. We were welcomed by a very civil woman in a white apron, whom I had seen curtsying at the door when I was on Ham's Back, about a quarter of a mile off. Likewise by a most beautiful little girl, or I thought her so, with a necklace of blue beads on, who wouldn't let me kiss her when I offered to, but ran away and hid herself. By and by, when we had dined in a sumptuous manner, off boiled dabs, melted butter, and potatoes, with a chop for me, a hairy man with a very good-natured face came home. As he called Peggotty lass, and gave her a hearty smack on the cheek, I had no doubt from the general propriety of her conduct that he was her brother, and so he turned out, being presently introduced to me as Mr. Peggotty, the master of the house. "Glad to see you, sir," said Mr. Peggotty. "You'll find us rough, sir, but you'll find us ready." I thanked him, and replied that I was sure I should be happy in such a delightful place. "How's your ma, sir?" said Mr. Peggotty. "Did you leave her pretty jolly?" I gave Mr. Peggotty to understand that she was as jolly as I could wish, and that she desired her compliments, which was a polite fiction on my part. "I'm much obliged to her, I'm sure," said Mr. Peggotty. "Well, sir, if you can make out here for a fortnight long with her," nodding at his sister, "and Ham and little Emily, we shall be proud of your company." Having done the honours of his house in this hospitable manner, Mr. Peggotty went out to wash himself in a kettleful of hot water, remarking that cold would never get his muck off. He soon returned, greatly improved in appearance, but so rubicund that I couldn't help thinking his face had this in common with the lobsters, crabs, and crawfish, that it went into the hot water very black and came out very red. After tea, when the door was shut and all was made snug, the nights being cold and misty now, it seemed to me the most delicious retreat that the imagination of man could conceive. To hear the wind getting up out at sea, to know that the fog was creeping over the desolate flat outside, and to look at the fire and think that there was no house near but this one, and this one a boat, was like enchantment. Little Emily had overcome her shyness, and was sitting by my side upon the lowest and least of the lockers, which was just large enough for us two, and just fitted into the chimney corner. Mrs. Peggotty, with the white apron, was knitting on the opposite side of the fire. Peggotty at her needlework was as much at home with St. Paul's and the bit of wax candle as if they had never known any other room. Ham, who had been giving me my first lesson in all fours, was trying to recollect a scheme of telling fortunes with the dirty cards, and was printing off fishy impressions of his thumb on all the cards he turned. Mr. Peggotty was smoking his pipe. I felt it was a time for conversation and confidence. "Mr. Peggotty," says I. "Sir," says he. "Did you give your son the name of Ham because you lived in a sort of ark?" Mr. Peggotty seemed to think it a deep idea, but answered, "No, sir, I never give him no name." "Who gave him that name, then?" said I, putting question number 2 of the catechism to Mr. Peggotty. "Why, sir, his father give it him," said Mr. Peggotty. "I thought you were his father." "My brother Joe was his father," said Mr. Peggotty. "Dead, Mr. Peggotty?" I hinted after a respectful pause. "Drowned dead," said Mr. Peggotty. I was very much surprised that Mr. Peggotty was not Ham's father, and began to wonder whether I was mistaken about his relationship to anybody else there. I was so curious to know that I made up my mind to have it out with Mr. Peggotty. "Little Emily," I said, glancing at her. "She is your daughter, isn't she, Mr. Peggotty?" "No, sir. My brother-in-law Tom was her father." I couldn't help it. "Dead, Mr. Peggotty?" I hinted after another respectful silence. "Drowned dead," said Mr. Peggotty. I felt the difficulty of resuming the subject, but had not got to the bottom of it yet, and must get to the bottom somehow, so I said, "Haven't you any children, Mr. Peggotty?" "No, master," he answered with a short laugh. "I'm a bachelor." "A bachelor?" I said, astonished. "Why, who's that, Mr. Peggotty?" pointing to the person in the apron who was knitting. "That's Mrs. Gummidge," said Mr. Peggotty. "Gummidge, Mr. Peggotty?" But at this point Peggotty, I mean my own peculiar Peggotty, made such impressive motions to me not to ask any more questions that I could only sit and look at all the silent company until it was time to go to bed. Then, in the privacy of my own little cabin, she informed me that Ham and Emily were an orphan nephew and niece, whom my host had at different times adopted in their childhood, when they were left destitute, and that Mrs. Gummidge was the widow of his partner in a boat who had died very poor. "He was but a poor man himself," said Peggotty, "but as good as gold and as true as steel." Those were her similes. The only subject, she informed me, on which he ever showed a violent temper or swore an oath was this generosity of his, and if it were ever referred to by any one of them, he struck the table a heavy blow with his right hand, had split it on one such occasion, and swore a dreadful oath that he would be gormed if he didn't cut and run for good if it was ever mentioned again. It appeared in answer to my inquiries that nobody had the least idea of the etymology of this terrible verb, passive, to be gormed, but that they all regarded it as constituting a most solemn imprecation. I was very sensible of my entertainer's goodness, and listened to the women's going to bed in another little crib like mine at the opposite end of the boat, and to him and Ham hanging up 2 hammocks for themselves on the hooks I had noticed in the roof in a very luxurious state of mind, enhanced by my being sleepy. As slumber gradually stole upon me, I heard the wind howling out at sea and coming on across the flat so fiercely that I had a lazy apprehension of the great deep arising in the night. But I bethought myself that I was in a boat after all, and that a man like Mr. Peggotty was not a bad person to have on board if anything did happen. Nothing happened, however, worse than morning. Almost as soon as it shone upon the oyster-shell frame of my mirror, I was out of bed and out with little Emily picking up stones upon the beach. "You're quite a sailor, I suppose?" I said to Emily. I don't know that I supposed anything of the kind, but I felt it an act of gallantry to say something, and a shining sail close to us made such a pretty little image of itself at the moment in her bright eye that it came into my head to say this. "No," replied Emily, shaking her head. "I'm afraid of the sea." "Afraid?" I said, with a becoming air of boldness, and looking very big at the mighty ocean. "I ain't." "Ah, but it's cruel," said Emily. "I have seen it very cruel to some of our men. I have seen it tear a boat as big as our house all to pieces." "I hope it wasn't the boat that father was drowned in," said Emily. "No, Not that one. I never saw that boat." "Nor him?" I asked her. Little Emily shook her head. "Not to remember." Here was a coincidence. I immediately went into an explanation how I had never seen my own father, and how my mother and I had always lived by ourselves in the happiest state imaginable, and lived so then, and always meant to live so, and how my father's grave was in the churchyard near our house, and shaded by a tree beneath the boughs of which I had walked and heard the birds sing many a pleasant morning. But there were some differences between Emily's orphanhood and mine, it appeared. She had lost her mother before her father, and where her father's grave was no one knew, except that it was somewhere in the depths of the sea. "Besides," said Emily, as she looked about for shells and pebbles, "your father was a gentleman, and your mother is a lady, and my father was a fisherman, and my mother was a fisherman's daughter, and my uncle Dan is a fisherman." "Dan is Mr. Peggotty, is he?" said I. "Uncle Dan, yonder," answered Emily, nodding at the boathouse. "Yes, I mean him. He must be very good, I should think." "Good," said Emily. "If I was ever to be a lady, I'd give him a sky-blue coat with diamond buttons, nankeen trousers, a red velvet waistcoat, a cocked hat, a large gold watch, a silver pipe, and a box of money." I said I had no doubt that Mr. Peggotty well deserved these treasures. I must acknowledge that I felt it difficult to picture him quite at his ease in the raiment proposed for him by his grateful little niece, and that I was particularly doubtful of the policy of the cocked hat, but I kept these sentiments to myself. Little Emily had stopped and looked up at the sky in her enumeration of these articles, as if they were a glorious vision. We went on again, picking up shells and pebbles. "You would like to be a lady?" I said. Emily looked at me, and laughed and nodded. "Yes." "I should like it very much. We would all be gentlefolks together then, me and Uncle and Ham and Mrs. Gummidge. We wouldn't mind then, when there comes stormy weather. Not for our own sakes, I mean. We would for the poor fishermen's, to be sure, and we'd help 'em with money when they come to any hurt." This seemed to me to be a very satisfactory and therefore not at all improbable picture. I expressed my pleasure in the contemplation of it, and little Emily was emboldened to say shyly, "Don't you think you are afraid of the sea now?" It was quiet enough to reassure me, but I have no doubt if I had seen a moderately large wave come tumbling in, I should have taken to my heels with an awful recollection of her drowned relations. However, I said, "No," and I added, "You don't seem to be either, though you say you are," for she was walking much too near the brink of a sort of old jetty or wooden causeway we had strolled upon, and I was afraid of her falling over. "I'm not afraid in this way," said little Emily, "but I wake when it blows, and tremble to think of Uncle Dan and Ham, and believe I hear him crying out for help. That's why I should like so much to be a lady. But I'm not afraid in this way, not a bit. Look here." She started from my side and ran along a jagged timber which protruded from the place we stood upon, and overhung the deep water at some height without the least defence. The incident is so impressed on my remembrance that if I were a draftsman I could draw its form here, I dare say, accurately as it was that day, and little Emily springing forward to her destruction, as it appeared to me, with a look that I have never forgotten, directed far out to sea. The light, bold, fluttering little fingers turned and came back safe to me, and I soon laughed at my fears, and at the cry I had uttered. Fruitlessly in any case, for there was no one near. But there have been times since, in my manhood, many times there have been, when I thought, is it possible, among the possibilities of hidden things, that in the sudden rashness of the child and her wild look so far off there was any merciful attraction of her into danger, any tempting her towards him permitted on the part of her dead father, that her life might have a chance of ending that day? There has been a time since when I have wondered whether, if the life before her could have been revealed to me at a glance, and so revealed as that a child could fully comprehend it, and if her preservation could have depended on a motion of my hand, I ought to have held it up to save her. There has been a time since, I do not say it lasted long, but it has been, when I have asked myself the question, would it have been better for little Emily to have had the waters close above her head that morning in my sight? and when I have answered yes, it would have been. This may be premature. I have set it down too soon, perhaps, but let it stand. We strolled a long way, and loaded ourselves with things that we thought curious, and put some stranded starfish carefully back into the water. I hardly know enough of the race at this moment to be quite certain whether they had reason to feel obliged to us for doing so, or the reverse, and then made our way home to Mr. Peggotty's dwelling. We stopped under the lee of the lobster outhouse to exchange an innocent kiss, and went into breakfast glowing with health and pleasure. "Like two young mavishes," Mr. Peggotty said. I knew this meant in our local dialect, like two young thrushes, and received it as a compliment. Of course, I was in love with little Emily. I am sure I loved that baby quite as truly, quite as tenderly, with greater purity and more disinterestedness than can enter into the best love of a later time of life, high and ennobling as it is. I am sure my fancy raised up something round that blue-eyed mite of a child, which etherealized and made a very angel of her. If any sunny forenoon she had spread a little pair of wings and flown away before my eyes, I don't think I should have regarded it as much more than I had reason to expect. We used to walk about that dim old flat at Yarmouth in a loving manner, hours and hours. The days sported by us as if time had not grown up himself yet, but were a child too, and always at play. I told Emily I adored her, and that unless she confessed she adored me, I should be reduced to the necessity of killing myself with a sword. She said she did, and I have no doubt she did. As to any sense of inequality or youthfulness or other difficulty in our way, little Emily and I had no such trouble because we had no future. We made no more provision for growing older than we did for growing younger. We were the admiration of Mrs. Gummidge and Peggotty, who used to whisper of an evening when we sat lovingly on our little locker side by side. "Lor, wasn't it beautiful?" Mr. Peggotty smiled at us from behind his pipe, and Ham grinned all the evening and did nothing else. They had something of the sort of pleasure in us, I suppose, that they might have had in a pretty toy or a pocket model of the Colosseum. I soon found out that Mrs. Gummidge did not always make herself so agreeable as she might have been expected to do under the circumstances of her residence with Mr. Peggotty. Mrs. Gummidge's was rather a fretful disposition, and she whimpered more sometimes than was comfortable for other parties in so small an establishment. I was very sorry for her, but there were moments when it would have been more agreeable, I thought, if Mrs. Gummidge had had a convenient apartment of her own to retire to, and had stopped there until her spirits revived. Mr. Peggotty went occasionally to a public-house called the Willing Mind. I discovered this by his being out on the second or third evening of our visit, and by Mrs. Gummidge's looking up at the Dutch clock between 8 and 9, and saying he was there, and that, what was more, she had known in the morning he would go there. Mrs. Gummidge had been in a low state all day, and had burst into tears in the forenoon when the fire smoked. "I am a lone, lorn creature," were Mrs. Gummidge's words, when that unpleasant occurrence took place, "and everything goes contrary with me." "Oh, he'll soon leave off," said Peggotty. I again mean our Peggotty. "And besides, you know, it's not more disagreeable to you than to us." "I feel it more," said Mrs. Gummidge. It was a very cold day, with cutting blasts of wind. Mrs. Gummidge's peculiar corner of the fireside seemed to me to be the warmest and snuggest in the place, as her chair was certainly the easiest. But it didn't suit her that day at all. She was constantly complaining of the cold, and of its occasioning a visitation in her back, which she called the creeps. At last she shed tears on that subject, and said again that she was a lone, lorn creature, and everything went contrary with her. "It is certainly very cold," said Peggotty. "Everybody must feel it so." "I feel it more than other people," said Mrs. Gummidge. So at dinner, when Mrs. Gummidge was always helped immediately after me, to whom the preference was given as a visitor of distinction, the fish was small and bony, and the potatoes were a little burnt. We all acknowledged that we felt this something of a disappointment, but Mrs. Gummidge said she felt it more than we did, and shed tears again, and made that former declaration with great bitterness. Accordingly, when Mr. Peggotty came home about 9 o'clock, this unfortunate Mrs. Gummidge was knitting in her corner in a very wretched and miserable condition. Peggotty had been working cheerfully. Ham had been patching up a great pair of water boots, and I, with little Emily by my side, had been reading to them. Mrs. Gummidge had never made any other remark than a forlorn sigh, and had never raised her eyes since tea. "Well, mates," said Mr. Peggotty, taking his seat, "and how are you?" We all said something or looked something to welcome him, except Mrs. Gummidge, who only shook her head over her knitting. "What's amiss?" said Mr. Peggotty, with a clap of his hands. "Cheer up, old mother." Mr. Peggotty meant old girl. Mrs. Gummidge did not appear to be able to cheer up. She took out an old black silk handkerchief and wiped her eyes, but instead of putting it in her pocket, kept it out and wiped them again, and still kept it out ready for use. "What's amiss, dame?" said Mr. Peggotty. "Nothing," returned Mrs. Gummidge. "You've come from the Willing Mind, Dan'l?" "Why, yes, I've took a short spell at the Willing Mind tonight," said Mr. Peggotty. "I'm sorry I should drive you there," said Mrs. Gummidge. "Drive? Ah, I don't want no driving," returned Mr. Peggotty with an honest laugh. "I only go too ready." "Very ready," said Mrs. Gummidge, shaking her head and wiping her eyes. "Yes, yes, very ready. I am sorry it should be along of me that you're so ready." "Along of you? It ain't along of you," said Mr. Peggotty. "Don't you believe a bit on it?" "Yes, yes, it is," cried Mrs. Gummidge. "I know what I am. I know that I am a lone lorn creature, and not only that everything goes contrary with me, but that I go contrary with everybody. Yes, yes, I feel more than other people do, and I show it more. It's my misfortune." I really couldn't help thinking, as I sat taking in all this, that the misfortune extended to some other members of that family besides Mrs. Gummidge. But Mr. Peggotty made no such retort, only answering with another entreaty to Mrs. Gummidge to cheer up. "I ain't what I could wish myself to be," said Mrs. Gummidge. "I am far from it. I know what I am. My troubles has made me contrary. I feel my troubles, and I make myself contrary. I wish I didn't feel 'em, but I do. I wish I could be hardened to 'em, but I ain't. I make the house uncomfortable. I don't wonder at it. I've made your sister so all day, and Master Davy." Here I was suddenly melted, and roared out, "No, you haven't, Mrs. Gummidge," in great mental distress. "It's far from right that I should do it," said Mrs. Gummidge. "It ain't a fit return. I had better go into the house and die. I am a lone lorn creature, and had much better not make myself contrary here. If things must go contrary with me, and I must go contrary myself, let me go contrary in my parish. Dan'l, I'd better go into the house and die and be a riddance." Mrs. Gummidge retired with these words, and betook herself to bed. When she was gone, Mr. Peggotty, who had not exhibited a trace of any feeling but the profoundest sympathy, looked round upon us, and, nodding his head with a lively expression of that sentiment still animating his face, said in a whisper, "She's been thinking of the old 'un." I did not quite understand what old one Mrs. Gummidge was supposed to have fixed her mind upon, until Peggotty, on seeing me to bed, explained that it was the late Mr. Gummidge, and that her brother always took that for a received truth on such occasions, and that it always had a moving effect upon him. Some time after he was in his hammock that night, I heard him myself repeat to Ham, "Poor thing, she's been thinking of the old 'un." And whenever Mrs. Gummidge was overcome in a similar manner during the remainder of our stay, which happened some few times, he always said the same thing in extenuation of the circumstance, and always with the tenderest commiseration. So the fortnight slipped away, varied by nothing but the variation of the tide, which altered Mr. Peggotty's times of going out and coming in, and altered Ham's engagements also. When the latter was unemployed, he sometimes walked with us to show us the boats and ships, and once or twice he took us for a row. I don't know why one slight set of impressions should be more particularly associated with a place than another, though I believe this obtains with most people, in reference especially to the associations of their childhood. I never hear the name, or read the name of Yarmouth, but I am reminded of a certain Sunday morning on the beach, the bells ringing for church, little Emily leaning on my shoulder, Ham lazily dropping stones into the water, and the sun, away at sea, just breaking through the heavy mist and showing us the ships like their own shadows. At last the day came for going home. I bore up against the separation from Mr. Peggotty and Mrs. Gummidge, but my agony of mind at leaving little Emily was piercing. We went arm in arm to the public house, where the carrier put up, and I promised on the road to write to her. I redeemed that promise afterwards in characters larger than those in which apartments are usually announced in manuscript as being to let. We were greatly overcome at parting, and if ever in my life I have had a void made in my heart, I had one made that day. Now all the time I had been on my visit, I had been ungrateful to my home again, and had thought little or nothing about it. But I was no sooner turned towards it than my reproachful young conscience seemed to point that way with a ready finger, and I felt all the more for the sinking of my spirits that it was my nest, and that my mother was my comforter and friend. This gained upon me as we went along, so that the nearer we drew, the more familiar the objects became that we passed, the more excited I was to get there and to run into her arms. But Peggotty, instead of sharing in those transports, tried to check them, though very kindly, and looked confused and out of sorts. Blunderstone Rookery would come, however, in spite of her, when the carrier's horse pleased, and did. How well I recollect it on a cold grey afternoon with a dull sky threatening rain. The door opened, and I looked, half laughing and half crying in my pleasant agitation, for my mother. It was not she, but a strange servant. "Why, Peggotty," I said ruefully, "isn't she come home?" Yes, Master Davy," said Peggotty. "She's come home. Wait a bit, Master Davy, and I'll tell you something." Between her agitation and her natural awkwardness in getting out of the cart, Peggotty was making a most extraordinary festoon of herself, but I felt too blank and strange to tell her so. When she had got down, she took me by the hand, led me wondering into the kitchen, and shut the door. "Peggotty," said I, quite frightened, "what's the matter?" "Oh, nothing's the matter, bless you, Master Davy dear," she answered, assuming an air of sprightliness. "Something's the matter, I'm sure. Where's Mamma?" "Where's Mamma, Master Davy?" repeated Peggotty. "Yes, why hasn't she come out to the gate, and what have we come in here for? Oh, Peggotty!" My eyes were full, and I felt as if I were going to tumble down. "Oh, bless the precious boy!" cried Peggotty, taking hold of me. "What is it? Speak, my pet." "Not dead, too? Oh, she's not dead, Peggotty." Peggotty cried out, "No," with an astonishing volume of voice, and then sat down and began to pant, and said I had given her a turn. I gave her a hug to take away the turn, or to give her another turn in the right direction, and then stood before her, looking at her in anxious inquiry. "You see, dear, I should have told you before now," said Peggotty, "but I hadn't an opportunity. I ought to have made it, perhaps, but I couldn't exactly." That was always the substitute for exactly in Peggotty's militia of words. Bring my mind to it. "Go on, Peggotty," said I, more frightened than before. "Master Davy," said Peggotty, untying her bonnet with a shaking hand, and speaking in a breathless sort of way. "What do you think? You've got a paw." I trembled and turned white. Something, I don't know what or how, connected with the grave in the churchyard and the raising of the dead, seemed to strike me like an unwholesome wind. "A new one," said Peggotty. "A new one?" I repeated. Peggotty gave a gasp, as if she were swallowing something that was very hard, and, putting out her hand, said, "Come and see him." "I don't want to see him." "And your mamma," said Peggotty. I ceased to draw back, and we went straight to the best parlour, where she left me. On one side of the fire sat my mother, on the other Mr. Murdstone. My mother dropped her work and arose hurriedly, but timidly, I thought. "Now, Clara, my dear," said Mr. Murdstone, "recollect, control yourself, always control yourself. Davy boy, how do you do?" I gave him my hand. After a moment of suspense, I went and kissed my mother. She kissed me, patted me gently on the shoulder, and sat down again to her work. I could not look at her. I could not look at him. I knew quite well that he was looking at us both, and I turned to the window and looked out there at some shrubs that were drooping their heads in the cold. As soon as I could creep away, I crept upstairs. My old dear bedroom was changed, and I was to lie a long way off. I rambled downstairs to find anything that was like itself, so altered it all seemed, and roamed into the yard. I very soon started back from there, for the empty dog kennel was filled up with a great dog, deep-mouthed and black-haired like him, and he was very angry at the sight of me and sprang out to get at me. The end of Chapter 3 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Read by Rick Kistner-Follett to go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 4. I Fall into Disgrace. If the room to which my bed was removed were a sentient thing that could give evidence, I might appeal to it at this day who sleeps there now, I wonder, to bear witness for me what a heavy heart I carried to it. I went up there, hearing the dog in the yard bark after me all the way while I climbed the stairs, and, looking as blank and strange upon the room as the room looked upon me, sat down with my small hands crossed and thought. I thought of the oddest things, of the shape of the room, of the cracks in the ceiling, of the paper on the walls, of the flaws in the window-glass making ripples and dimples on the prospect, of the washing-stand being rickety on its 3 legs, and having a discontented something about it, which reminded me of Mrs. Gummidge under the influence of the old one. I was crying all the time, but, except that I was conscious of being cold and dejected, I am sure I never thought why I cried. At last, in my desolation, I began to consider that I was dreadfully in love with little Emily, and had been torn away from her to come here when no one seemed to want me or to care about me half as much as she did. This made such a very miserable piece of business of it, that I rolled myself up in a corner of the counterpane and cried myself to sleep. I was awoke by somebody saying, "Here he is," and uncovering my hot head. My mother and Peggotty had come to look for me, and it was one of them who had done it. "Davy," said my mother, "what's the matter?" I thought it was very strange that she should ask me, and answered, "Nothing." I turned over on my face, I recollect, to hide my trembling lip, which answered her with greater truth. "Davy," said my mother, "Davy, my child." I dare say no words she could have uttered would have affected me so much then as her calling me her child. I hid my tears in the bedclothes, and pressed her from me with my hand when she would have raised me up. "This is your doing, Peggotty, you cruel thing," said my mother. "I have no doubt at all about it. How can you reconcile it to your conscience, I wonder, to prejudice my own boy against me, or against anybody who is dear to me? What do you mean by it, Peggotty?" Poor Peggotty lifted up her hands and eyes, and only answered in a sort of paraphrase of the grace I usually repeated after dinner. "Lord forgive you, Mrs. Copperfield, and for what you have said this minute, may you never be truly sorry." "It's enough to distract me," cried my mother. "In my honeymoon, too, when my most inveterate enemy might relent, one would think, and not envy me a little peace of mind and happiness. Davy, you naughty boy! Peggotty, you savage creature!" "Oh, dear me!" cried my mother, turning from one of us to the other in her pettish, wilful manner. "What a troublesome world this is, when one has the most right to expect it to be as agreeable as possible." I felt the touch of a hand that I knew was neither hers nor Peggotty's, and slipped to my feet at the bedside. It was Mr. Murdstone's hand, and he kept it on my arm as he said, "What's this? Clara, my love, have you forgotten? Firmness, my dear." "I am very sorry, Edward," said my mother. "I meant to be very good, but I am so uncomfortable." "Indeed," he answered. "That's a bad hearing so soon, Clara." "I say it's very hard I should be made so now," returned my mother, pouting, "and it is very hard, isn't it?" He drew her to him, whispered in her ear, and kissed her. I knew as well when I saw my mother's head lean down upon his shoulder, and her arm touch his neck. I knew as well that he could mould her pliant nature into any form he chose, as I know now that he did. "Go you below, my love," said Mr. Murdstone. "David and I will come down together." "My friend," turning a darkening face on Peggotty when he had watched my mother out, and dismissed her with a nod and a smile, "do you know your mistress's name?" "She has been my mistress a long time, sir," answered Peggotty. "I ought to know it." "That's true," he answered. "But I thought I heard you, as I came upstairs, address her by a name that is not hers. She has taken mine, you know. Will you remember that?" Peggotty, with some uneasy glances at me, curtsied herself out of the room without replying, seeing, I suppose, that she was expected to go, and had no excuse for remaining. When we two were left alone, he shut the door, and sitting on a chair and holding me standing before him, looked steadily into my eyes. I felt my own attracted no less steadily to his. As I recall our being opposed thus face to face, I seem again to hear my heart beat fast and high. "David," he said, making his lips thin by pressing them together, "if I have an obstinate horse or dog to deal with, what do you think I do?" "I don't know." "I beat him." I had answered in a kind of breathless whisper, but I felt in my silence that my breath was shorter now. "I make him wince and smart. I say to myself, I'll conquer that fellow, and if it were to cost him all the blood he had, I should do it." "What is that upon your face?" "Dirt," I said. He knew it was the mark of tears as well as I, but if he had asked the question 20 times, each time with 20 blows, I believe my baby heart would have burst before I would have told him so. "You have a good deal of intelligence for a little fellow," he said, with a grave smile that belonged to him, "and you understand me very well, I see. Wash that face, sir, and come down with me." He pointed to the washing-stand, which I had made out to be like Mrs. Gummidge, and motioned me with his head to obey him directly. I had little doubt then, and I have less doubt now, that he would have knocked me down without the least compunction if I had hesitated. "Clara, my dear," he said, when I had done his bidding, and he walked me into the parlour with his hand still on my arm, "you will not be made uncomfortable any more, I hope. We shall soon improve our youthful humours." God help me. I might have been improved for my whole life. I might have been made another creature, perhaps, for life, by a kind word at that season, a word of encouragement, an explanation, of pity for my childish ignorance, of welcome home, of reassurance to me that it was home, might have made me dutiful to him in my heart henceforth, instead of in my hypocritical outside, and might have made me respect instead of hate him. I thought my mother was sorry to see me standing in the room so scared and strange, and that presently, when I stole to a chair, she followed me with her eyes more sorrowfully still, missing, perhaps, some freedom in my childish tread, but the word was not spoken, and the time for it was gone. We dined alone, we three together. He seemed to be very fond of my mother. I am afraid I liked him none the better for that, and she was very fond of him. I gathered from what they said that an elder sister of his was coming to stay with them, and that she was expected that evening. I am not certain whether I found out then or afterwards that, without being actively concerned in any business, he had some share in or some annual charge upon the profits of a wine merchant's house in London, with which his family had been connected from his great-grandfather's time, and in which his sister had a similar interest. But I may mention it in this place, whether or no. After dinner, when we were sitting by the fire, and I was meditating an escape to Peggotty without having the hardihood to slip away, lest it should offend the master of the house, a coach drove up to the garden gate, and he went out to receive the visitor. My mother followed him. I was timidly following her when she turned round at the parlour door in the dusk, and taking me in her embrace, as she had been used to do, whispered me to love my new father and be obedient to him. She did this hurriedly and secretly, as if it were wrong, but tenderly, and, putting out her hand behind her, held mine in it until we came near to where he was standing in the garden, where she let mine go and drew hers through his arm. It was Miss Murdstone who was arrived, and a gloomy-looking lady she was, dark like her brother, whom she greatly resembled in face and voice, and with very large eyebrows nearly meeting over her large nose, as if, being disabled by the wrongs of her sex from wearing whiskers, she had carried them to that account. She brought with her 2 uncompromising hard black boxes, with her initials on the lids in hard brass nails. When she paid the coachman, she took her money out of a hard steel purse, and she kept the purse in a very jail of a bag, which hung upon her arm by a heavy chain, and shut up like a bite. I had never, at that time, seen such a metallic lady altogether as Miss Murdstone was. She was brought into the parlour with many tokens of welcome, and there formally recognized my mother as a new and near relation. Then she looked at me and said, "Is that your boy, sister-in-law?" My mother acknowledged me. "Generally speaking," said Miss Murdstone, "I don't like boys. How do you do, boy?" Under these encouraging circumstances, I replied that I was very well, and that I hoped she was the same, with such an indifferent grace that Miss Murdstone disposed of me in 2 words. "Once manner." Having uttered which, with great distinctness, she begged the favour of being shown to her room, which became to me from that time forth a place of awe and dread, wherein the 2 black boxes were never seen open or known to be left unlocked, and where, for I peeped in once or twice when she was out, numerous little steel fetters and rivets with which Miss Murdstone embellished herself when she was dressed generally hung upon the looking-glass in a formidable array. As well as I could make out, she had come for good, and had no intention of ever going again. She began to help my mother next morning, and was in and out of the store closet all day, putting things to rights and making havoc in the old arrangements. Almost the first remarkable thing I observed in Miss Murdstone was her being constantly haunted by a suspicion that the servants had a man secreted somewhere on the premises. Under the influence of this delusion, she dived into the coal cellar at the most untimely hours, and scarcely ever opened the door of a dark cupboard without clapping it to again in the belief that she had got him. Though there was nothing very airy about Miss Murdstone, she was a perfect lark in point of getting up. She was up, and as I believe to this hour, looking for that man, before anybody in the house was stirring. Peggotty gave it as her opinion that she even slept with one eye open, but I could not concur in this idea, for I tried it myself after hearing the suggestion thrown out, and found it couldn't be done. On the very first morning after her arrival she was up and ringing her bell at cock-crow. When my mother came down to breakfast and was going to make the tea, Miss Murdstone gave her a kind of peck on the cheek, which was her nearest approach to a kiss, and said, "Now, Clara, my dear, I am come here, you know, to relieve you of all the trouble I can. You're much too pretty and thoughtless." My mother blushed but laughed, and seemed not to dislike this character, "to have any duties imposed upon you that can be undertaken by me. If you'll be so good as to give me your keys, my dear, I'll attend to all this sort of thing in the future." From that time Miss Murdstone kept the keys in her own little jail all day, and under her pillow at night, and my mother had no more to do with them than I had. My mother did not suffer her authority to pass from her without a shadow of protest. One night, when Miss Murdstone had been developing certain household plans to her brother, of which he signified his approbation, my mother suddenly began to cry, and said she thought she might have been consulted. "Clara," said Mr. Murdstone sternly, "Clara, I wonder at you." "Oh, it's very well to say you wonder, Edward," cried my mother, "and it's very well for you to talk about firmness, but you wouldn't like it yourself." Firmness, I may observe, was the grand quality on which both Mr. and Miss Murdstone took their stand. However I might have expressed my comprehension of it at that time, if I had been called upon, I nevertheless did clearly comprehend in my own way that it was another name for tyranny, and for a certain gloomy, arrogant devil's humour that was in them both. The creed, as I should state it now, was this: Mr. Murdstone was firm. Nobody in his world was to be so firm as Mr. Murdstone. Nobody else in his world was to be firm at all, for everybody was to be bent to his firmness. Miss Murdstone was an exception. She might be firm, but only by relationship, and in an inferior and tributary degree. My mother was another exception. She might be firm, and must be, but only in bearing their firmness, and firmly believing there was no other firmness upon earth. "It's very hard," said my mother, "that in my own house—" "My own house?" repeated Mr. Murdstone. "Clara!" "Our own house, I mean," faltered my mother, evidently frightened. "I hope you must know what I mean, Edward. It's very hard that in your own house I may not have a word to say about domestic matters. I am sure I managed very well before we were married." "There's evidence," said my mother, sobbing. "Ask Peggotty if I didn't do very well when I wasn't interfered with." "Edward," said Miss Murdstone, "let there be an end of this. I go tomorrow." "Jane Murdstone," said her brother, "be silent. How dare you to insinuate that you don't know my character better than your words imply?" "I am sure," my poor mother went on at a grievous disadvantage, and with many tears, "I don't want anybody to go. I should be very miserable and unhappy if anybody was to go. I don't ask much. I am not unreasonable. I only want to be consulted sometimes. I am very much obliged to anybody who assists me, and I only want to be consulted as a mere form sometimes. I thought you were pleased once with my being a little inexperienced and girlish, Edward. I am sure you said so, but you seem to hate me for it now, you are so severe." "Edward," said Miss Murdstone again, "let there be an end of this. I go tomorrow." "Jane Murdstone," thundered Mr. Murdstone, "will you be silent? How dare you?" Miss Murdstone made a jail delivery of her pocket handkerchief and held it before her eyes. "Clara," he continued, looking at my mother, "you surprise me, you astound me. Yes, I had a satisfaction in the thought of marrying an inexperienced and artless person, and forming her character, and infusing into it some amount of that firmness and decision of which it stood in need. But when Jane Murdstone is kind enough to come to my assistance in this endeavour, and to assume for my sake a condition something like a housekeeper's, and when she meets with a base return—" "Oh, pray, Edward," cried my mother, "don't accuse me of being ungrateful. I am sure I am not ungrateful. No one ever said I was before. I have many faults, but not that. Oh, don't, my dear." "When Jane Murdstone meets, I say," he went on, after waiting until my mother was silent, "with a base return, that feeling of mine is chilled and altered." "Don't, my love, say that," implored my mother very piteously. "Oh, don't, Edward. I can't bear to hear it. Whatever I am affectionate. I know I am affectionate. I wouldn't say it if I wasn't sure that I am. Ask Peggotty. I am sure she'll tell you I'm affectionate." "There is no extent of mere weakness, Clara," said Mr. Murdstone in reply, "that can have the least weight with me. You lose breath." "Pray let us be friends," said my mother. "I couldn't live under coldness or unkindness. I am so sorry. I have a great many defects, I know, and it's very good of you, Edward, with your strength of mind, to endeavour to correct them for me. Jane, I don't object to anything. I should be quite broken-hearted if you thought of leaving." My mother was too much overcome to go on. "Jane Murdstone," said Mr. Murdstone to his sister, "any harsh words between us are, I hope, uncommon. It is not my fault that so unusual an occurrence has taken place tonight. I was betrayed into it by another. Nor is it your fault. You were betrayed into it by another. Let us both try to forget it." And at this he added, after these magnanimous words, "It is not a fit scene for the boy, David. Go to bed." I could hardly find the door through the tears that stood in my eyes. I was so sorry for my mother's distress, but I groped my way out, and groped my way up to my room in the dark, without even having the heart to say good-night to Peggotty, or to get a candle from her. When her coming up to look for me an hour or so afterwards awoke me, she said that my mother had gone to bed poorly, and that Mr. and Miss Murdstone were sitting alone. Going down next morning rather earlier than usual, I paused outside the parlour door on hearing my mother's voice. She was very earnestly and humbly entreating Miss Murdstone's pardon, which that lady granted, and a perfect reconciliation took place. I never knew my mother afterwards to give an opinion on any matter without first appealing to Miss Murdstone, or without having first ascertained by some sure means what Miss Murdstone's opinion was, and I never saw Miss Murdstone, when out of temper, she was infirm that way, move her hand towards her bag as if she were going to take out the keys and offer to resign them to my mother without seeing that my mother was in a terrible fright. The gloomy taint that was in the Murdstone blood darkened the Murdstone religion, which was austere and wrathful. I have thought since that its assuming that character was a necessary consequence of Mr. Murdstone's firmness, which wouldn't allow him to let anybody off from the utmost weight of the severest penalties he could find any excuse for. Be this as it may, I well remember the tremendous visages with which we used to go to church, and the changed air of the place. Again the dreaded Sunday comes round, and I file into the old pew first, like a guarded captive brought to a condemned service. Again Miss Murdstone, in a black velvet gown that looks as if it had been made out of a pall, follows close upon me, then my mother, then her husband. There is no Peggotty now as in the old time. Again I listen to Miss Murdstone mumbling the responses and emphasizing all the dread words with a cruel relish. Again I see her dark eyes roll round the church when she says miserable sinners, as if she were calling all the congregation names. Again I catch rare glimpses of my mother moving her lips timidly between the two, with one of them muttering at each ear like low thunder. Again I wonder with a sudden fear whether it is likely that our good old clergyman can be wrong, and Mr. and Miss Murdstone right, and that all the angels in heaven can be destroying angels. Again, if I move a finger or relax a muscle of my face, Miss Murdstone pokes me with her prayer book and makes my side ache. Yes, and again as we walk home, I note some neighbours looking at my mother and at me and whispering. Again as the three go on arm in arm, and I linger behind alone, I follow some of those looks, and wonder if my mother's step be really not so light as I have seen it, and if the gaiety of her beauty be really almost worried away. Again, I wonder whether any of the neighbours call to mind as I do how we used to walk home together, she and I wonder stupidly about that all the dreary, dismal day. There had been some talk on occasions of my going to boarding school. Mr. and Miss Murdstone had originated it, and my mother had of course agreed with them. Nothing, however, was concluded on the subject yet. In the meantime, I learnt lessons at home. Shall I ever forget those lessons? They were presided over nominally by my mother, but really by Mr. Murdstone and his sister, who were always present, and found them a favourable occasion for giving my mother lessons in that miscalled firmness which was the bane of both our lives. I believe I was kept at home for that purpose. I had been apt enough to learn, and willing enough, when my mother and I had lived alone together. I can faintly remember learning the alphabet at her knee. To this day, when I look upon the fat black letters in the primer, the puzzling novelty of their shapes, and the easy good nature of O and Q and S seem to present themselves again before me as they used to do. But they recall no feeling of disgust or reluctance. On the contrary, I seem to have walked along a path of flowers as far as the crocodile book, and to have been cheered by the gentleness of my mother's voice and manner all the way. But these solemn lessons which succeeded those I remember as the death-blow of my peace, and a grievous daily drudgery and misery. They were very long, very numerous, very hard, perfectly unintelligible, some of them to me, and I was generally as much bewildered by them as I believe my poor mother was herself. Let me remember how it used to be, and bring one morning back again. I came into the second-best parlour after breakfast with my books and an exercise book and a slate. My mother is ready for me at her writing-desk, but not half so ready as Mr. Murdstone in his easy-chair by the window, though he pretends to be reading a book, or as Miss Murdstone sitting near my mother stringing steel beads. The very sight of these two has such an influence over me that I begin to feel the words I have been at infinite pains to get into my head, all sliding away and going I don't know where. I wonder where they do go, by the by. I hand the first book to my mother. Perhaps it is a grammar, perhaps a history or geography. I take a last drowning look at the page as I give it into her hand, and start off aloud at a racing pace while I have got it fresh. I trip over a word. Mr. Murdstone looks up. I trip over another word. Miss Murdstone looks up. I redden, tumble over half a dozen words, and stop. I think my mother would show me the book if she dared, but she does not dare, and she says softly, "Oh, Davy, Davy." "Now, Clara," says Mr. Murdstone, "be firm with the boy. Don't say, 'Oh, Davy, Davy,' that's childish. He knows his lesson, or he does not know it." "He does not know it," Miss Murdstone interposes awfully. "I am really afraid he does not," says my mother. "Then you see, Clara," returns Miss Murdstone, "you should just give him the book back and make him know it." "Yes, certainly," says my mother. "That is what I intend to do, my dear Jane. Now, Davy, try once more, and don't be stupid." I obey the first clause of the injunction by trying once more, but am not so successful with the second, for I am very stupid. I tumble down before I get to the old place, at a point where I was all right before, and stop to think. But I can't think about the lesson. I think of the number of yards of net in Miss Murdstone's cap, or of the price of Mr. Murdstone's dressing-gown, or any such ridiculous problem that I have no business with, and don't want to have anything at all to do with. Mr. Murdstone makes a movement of impatience which I have been expecting for a long time. Miss Murdstone does the same. My mother glances submissively at them, shuts the book, and lays it by as an arrear to be worked out when my other tasks are done. There is a pile of these arrears very soon, and it swells like a rolling snowball. The bigger it gets, the more stupid I get. The case is so hopeless, and I feel that I am wallowing in such a bog of nonsense that I give up all idea of getting out and abandon myself to my fate. The despairing way in which my mother and I look at each other as I blunder on is truly melancholy. But the greatest effect in these miserable lessons is when my mother, thinking nobody is observing her, tries to give me the cue by the motion of her lips. At that instant, Miss Murdstone, who has been lying in wait for nothing else all along, says in a deep, warning voice, "Clara!" My mother starts, colours, and smiles faintly. Mr. Murdstone comes out of his chair, takes the book, throws it at me, or boxes my ears with it, and turns me out of the room by the shoulders. Even when the lessons are done, the worst is yet to happen, in the shape of an appalling sum. This is invented for me and delivered to me orally by Mr. Murdstone, and begins, "If I go into a cheesemonger's shop and buy 5,000 double Gloucester cheeses at 4 halfpenny each, present payment," at which I see Miss Murdstone secretly overjoyed. I pore over these cheeses without any result or enlightenment until dinner-time, when, having made a mulatto of myself by getting the dirt of the slate into the pores of my skin, I have a slice of bread to help me out with the cheeses, and am considered in disgrace for the rest of the evening. It seems to me at this distance of time as if my unfortunate studies generally took this course. I could have done very well if I had been without the Murdstones, but the influence of the Murdstones upon me was like the fascination of two snakes on a wretched young bird. Even when I did get through the trouble with tolerable credit, there was not much gained but dinner, for Miss Murdstone never could endure to see me untasked, and if I rashly made any show of being unemployed, called her brother's attention to me by saying, "Clara, my dear, there's nothing like work. Give your boy an exercise," which caused me to be clapped down to some new labour there and then. As to any recreation with other children of my age, I had very little of that, for the gloomy theology of the Murdstones made all children out to be a swarm of little vipers, though there was a child once set in the midst of the disciples, and held that they contaminated one another. The natural result of this treatment, continued, I suppose, for some 6 months or more, was to make me sullen, dull, and dogged. I was not made the less so by my sense of being daily more and more shut out and alienated from my mother. I believe I should have been almost stupefied but for one circumstance. It was this. My father had left a small collection of books in a little room upstairs, to which I had access, for it adjoined my own, and which nobody else in our house ever troubled. From that blessed little room, Roderick Random, Peregrine Pickle, Humphrey Clinker, Tom Jones, the Vicar of Wakefield, Don Quixote, Gil Blas, and Robinson Crusoe came out, a glorious host to keep me company. They kept alive my fancy and my hope of something beyond that place and time. They, and the Arabian Nights, and the tales of the genie, and did me no harm, for whatever harm was in some of them was not there for me. I knew nothing of it. It is astonishing to me now how I found time, in the midst of my porings and blunderings over heavier themes, to read those books as I did. It is curious to me how I could ever have consoled myself under my small troubles, which were great troubles to me, by impersonating my favourite characters in them as I did, and by putting Mr. and Miss Murdstone into all the bad ones, which I did too. I have been Tom Jones, a child's Tom Jones, a harmless creature, for a week together. I have sustained my own idea of Roderick Random for a month at a stretch, I verily believe. I had a greedy relish for a few volumes of voyages and travels, I forget what now, that were on those shelves, and for days and days I can remember to have gone about my region of our house armed with a centrepiece out of an old set of boot trees, the perfect realization of Captain Somebody of the Royal British Navy in danger of being beset by savages, and resolved to sell his life at a great price. The captain never lost dignity from having his ears boxed with the Latin grammar. I did, but the captain was a captain and a hero, in despite of all the grammars of all the languages in the world, dead or alive. This was my only and my constant comfort. When I think of it, the picture always rises in my mind of a summer evening, the boys at play in the churchyard, and I sitting on my bed, reading as if for life. Every barn in the neighbourhood, every stone in the church, and every foot of the churchyard had some association of its own in my mind, connected with these books, and stood for some locality made famous in them. I have seen Tom Pipes go climbing up the church steeple. I have watched Strap, with a knapsack on his back, stopping to rest himself upon the wicket gate, and I know that Commodore Trunnion held that club with Mr. Pickle in the parlour of our little village alehouse. The reader now understands, as well as I do, what I was when I came to that point of my youthful history to which I am now coming again. One morning when I went into the parlour with my books, I found my mother looking anxious, Miss Murdstone looking firm, and Mr. Murdstone binding something around the bottom of a cane, a lithe and limber cane which he left off binding when I came in, and poised and switched in the air. "I tell you, Clara," said Mr. Murdstone, "I have been often flogged myself." "To be sure, of course," said Miss Murdstone. "Certainly, my dear Jane," faltered my mother meekly. But do you think it did Edward good?" "Do you think it did Edward harm, Clara?" asked Mr. Murdstone gravely. "That's the point," said his sister. To this my mother returned, "Certainly, my dear Jane," and said no more. I felt apprehensive that I was personally interested in this dialogue, and sought Mr. Murdstone's eye as it lighted on mine. "Now, David," he said, and I saw that cast again as he said it, "you must be far more careful today than usual." He gave the cane another poise and another switch, and having finished his preparation of it, laid it down beside him with an impressive look, and took up his book. This was a good freshener to my presence of mind as a beginning. I felt the words of my lesson slipping off not one by one or line by line, but by the entire page. I tried to lay hold of them, but they seemed, if I may so express it, to have put skates on, and to skim away from me with a smoothness there was no checking. We began badly and went on worse. I had come in with an idea of distinguishing myself rather, conceiving that I was very well prepared. But it turned out to be quite a mistake. Book after book was added to the heap of failures, Miss Murdstone being firmly watchful of us all the time. And when we came at last to the 5,000 cheeses, canes he made it that day, I remember, my mother burst out crying. "Clara," said Miss Murdstone in her warning voice. "I am not quite well, my dear Jane, I think," said my mother. I saw him wink solemnly at his sister as he rose and said, taking up the cane, "Why, Jane, we can hardly expect Clara to bear with perfect firmness the worry and torment that David has occasioned her today. That would be stoical. Clara is greatly strengthened and improved, but we can hardly expect so much from her. David, you and I will go upstairs, boy." As he took me out at the door, my mother ran towards us. Miss Murdstone said, "Clara, are you a perfect fool?" and interfered. I saw my mother stop her ears then, and I heard her crying. He walked me up to my room slowly and gravely. I am certain he had a delight in that formal parade of executing justice, and when we got there suddenly twisted my head under his arm. "Mr. Murdstone, sir," I cried to him, pray don't beat me. I have tried to learn, sir, but I can't learn while you and Miss Murdstone are by. I can't indeed." "Can't you indeed, David?" he said. "We'll try that." He had my head as in a vice, but I twined around him somehow, and stopped him for a moment, entreating him not to beat me. It was only a moment that I stopped him, for he cut me heavily an instant afterwards, and in the same instant I caught the hand with which he held me in my mouth between my teeth, and bit it through. It sets my teeth on edge to think of it. He beat me then as if he would have beaten me to death. Above all the noise we made, I heard them running up the stairs and crying out. I heard my mother crying out, and Peggotty. Then he was gone, and the door was locked outside, and I was lying fevered and hot and torn and sore and raging in my puny way upon the floor. How well I recollect when I became quiet, what an unnatural stillness seemed to reign through the whole house. How well I remember when my smart and passion began to cool, how wicked I began to feel. I sat listening for a long while, but there was not a sound. I crawled up from the floor and saw my face in the glass so swollen, red, and ugly that it almost frightened me. My stripes were sore and stiff and made me cry afresh when I moved, but they were nothing to the guilt I felt. It lay heavier on my breast than if I had been a most atrocious criminal, I dare say. It had begun to grow dark, and I had shut the window. I had been lying for the most part with my head upon the sill, by turns crying, dozing, and looking listlessly out, when the key was turned, and Miss Murdstone came in with some bread and meat and milk. These she put down upon the table without a word, glaring at me the while with exemplary firmness, and then retired, locking the door after her. Long after it was dark, I sat there, wondering whether anybody else would come. When this appeared improbable for the night, I undressed and went to bed, and there I began to wonder fretfully what would be done to me, whether it was a criminal act that I had committed, whether I should be taken into custody and sent to prison, whether I was at all in danger of being hanged. I never shall forget the waking next morning, the being cheerful and fresh for the first moment, and then the being weighed down by the stale and dismal oppression of remembrance. Miss Murdstone reappeared before I was out of bed, told me in so many words that I was free to walk in the garden for half an hour and no longer, and retired, leaving the door open that I might avail myself of that permission. I did so, and did so every morning of my imprisonment, which lasted 5 days. If I could have seen my mother alone, I should have gone down on my knees to her and besought her forgiveness. But I saw no one, Miss Murdstone excepted, during the whole time, except at evening prayers in the parlour, to which I was escorted by Miss Murdstone after everybody else was placed, where I was stationed, a young outlaw, all alone by myself near the door, and whence I was solemnly conducted by my jailer before any one arose from the devotional posture. I only observed that my mother was as far off from me as she could be, and kept her face another way so that I never saw it, and that Mr. Murdstone's hand was bound up in a large linen wrapper. The length of those 5 days I can convey no idea of to anyone. They occupy the place of years in my remembrance. The way in which I listened to all the incidents of the house that made themselves audible to me, the ringing of bells, the opening and shutting of doors, the murmuring of voices, the footsteps on the stairs, to any laughing, whistling, or singing outside which seemed more dismal than anything else to me in my solitude and disgrace, the uncertain pace of the hours, especially at night, when I would wake thinking it was morning, and find that the family were not yet gone to bed, and that all the length of night had yet to come, the depressed dreams and nightmares I had, the return of day, noon, afternoon, evening, when the boys played in the churchyard, and I watched them from a distance within the room, being ashamed to show myself at the window, lest they should know I was a prisoner, the strange sensation of never hearing myself speak, the fleeting intervals of something like cheerfulness, which came with eating and drinking, and went away with it, the setting in of rain one evening with a fresh smell, and its coming down faster and faster between me and the church, until it and gathering night seemed to quench me in gloom and fear and remorse. All this appears to have gone round and round for years instead of days. It is so vividly and strongly stamped on my remembrance. On the last night of my restraint, I was awakened by hearing my own name spoken in a whisper. I started up in bed, and putting out my arms in the dark, said, "Is that you, Peggotty?" There was no immediate answer, but presently I heard my name again, in a tone so very mysterious and awful that I think I should have gone into a fit if it had not occurred to me that it must have come through the keyhole. I groped my way to the door, and putting my own lips to the keyhole, whispered, "Is that you, Peggotty, dear?" "Yes, my own precious Davy," she replied. "Be as soft as a mouse, or the cat'll hear us." I understood this to mean Miss Murdstone, and was sensible of the urgency of the case, her room being close by. "How's Mamma, dear Peggotty? Is she very angry with me?" I could hear Peggotty crying softly on her side of the keyhole, as I was doing on mine, before she answered, "No, not very." "What is going to be done with me, Peggotty, dear, do you know?" "School, near London," was Peggotty's answer. I was obliged to get her to repeat it, for she spoke it the first time quite down my throat, in consequence of my having forgotten to take my mouth away from the keyhole and put my ear there, and though her words tickled me a good deal, I didn't hear them. "When, Peggotty?" "Tomorrow." "Is that the reason why Miss Murdstone took the clothes out of my drawers, which she had done, though I have forgotten to mention it?" "Yes," said Peggotty. "Box." "Shan't I see Mamma?" "Yes," said Peggotty. "Morning." Then Peggotty fitted her mouth close to the keyhole, and delivered these words through it with as much feeling and earnestness as a keyhole has ever been the medium of communicating. I will venture to assert, shooting in each broken little sentence in a convulsive little burst of its own. "Davy, dear, if I ain't been exactly as intimate with you lately as I used to be, it ain't because I don't love you, just as well and more, my pretty poppet. It's because I thought it better for you, and for someone else besides. Davy, my darling, are you listening? Can you hear?" "Yes, yes, Peggotty," I sobbed. "My own," said Peggotty, with infinite compassion. "What I want to say is that you must never forget me, for I'll never forget you, and I'll take as much care of your mamma, Davy, as I ever took care of you, and I won't leave her. The day may come when she'll be glad to lay her poor head on her stupid cross old Peggotty's arm again, and I'll write to you, my dear, though I ain't no scholar, and I'll—" Peggotty fell to kissing the keyhole, as she couldn't kiss me. "Thank you, dear Peggotty," said I. "Oh, thank you, thank you. Will you promise me one thing, Peggotty? Will you write and tell Mr. Peggotty and little Emily and Mrs. Gummidge and Ham that I am not so bad as they might suppose, and that I sent 'em all my love, especially to little Emily? Will you, if you please, Peggotty?" The kind soul promised, and we both of us kissed the keyhole with the greatest affection. I patted it with my hand, I recollect, as if it had been her honest face, and parted. From that night there grew up in my breast a feeling for Peggotty which I cannot very well define. She did not replace my mother, no one could do that, but she came into a vacancy in my heart which closed upon her, and I felt towards her something I have never felt for any other human being. It was a sort of comical affection, too, and yet, if she had died, I cannot think what I should have done, or how I should have acted out the tragedy it would have been to me. In the morning, Miss Murdstone appeared as usual, and told me I was going to school, which was not altogether such news to me as she supposed. She also informed me that, when I was dressed, I was to come downstairs into the parlour and have my breakfast. There I found my mother, very pale and with red eyes, into whose arms I ran and begged her pardon from my suffering soul. "Oh, Davy," she said, "that you could hurt anyone I love. Try to be better, pray to be better. I forgive you, but I am so grieved, Davy, that you should have such bad passions in your heart." They had persuaded her that I was a wicked fellow, and she was more sorry for that than for my going away. I felt it sorely. I tried to eat my parting breakfast, but my tears dropped upon my bread and butter and trickled into my tea. I saw my mother look at me sometimes, and then glance at the watchful Miss Murdstone, and then look down or look away. "Master Copperfield's box there," said Miss Murdstone, when wheels were heard at the gate. I looked for Peggotty, but it was not she. Neither she nor Mr. Murdstone appeared. My former acquaintance, the carrier, was at the door. The box was taken out to his cart and lifted in. "Clara," said Miss Murdstone in her warning note. "Ready, my dear Jane," returned my mother. "Good-bye, Davy. You are going for your own good. Good-bye, my child. You will come home in the holidays and be a better boy." "Clara," Miss Murdstone repeated. "Certainly, my dear Jane," replied my mother, who was holding me. "I forgive you, my dear boy. God bless you." "Clara," Miss Murdstone repeated. Miss Murdstone was good enough to take me out to the cart and to say, on the way, that she hoped I would repent before I came to a bad end, and then I got into the cart, and the lazy horse walked off with it. The end of Chapter 4 of David Copperfield. Read by Rick Kishner for Lit to Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 5. I am sent away from home. We might have gone about half a mile, and my pocket handkerchief was quite wet through, when the carrier stopped short. Looking out to ascertain, for what, I saw, to my amazement, Peggotty burst from a hedge and climb into the cart. She took me in both her arms and squeezed me to her stays until the pressure on my nose was extremely painful, though I never thought of that till afterwards, when I found it very tender. Not a single word did Peggotty speak. Releasing one of her arms, she put it down in her pocket to the elbow, and brought out some paper bags of cakes, which she crammed into my pockets, and a purse, which she put into my hand, but not one word did she say. After another and a final squeeze with both arms, she got down from the cart and ran away, and my belief is, and always has been, without a solitary button on her gown. I picked up one of several that were rolling about, and treasured it as a keepsake for a long time. The carrier looked at me as if to inquire if she were coming back. I shook my head and said I thought not. "Then come up," said the carrier to the lazy horse, who came up accordingly. Having by this time cried as much as I possibly could, I began to think it was of no use crying any more, especially as neither Roderick Random nor that captain in the Royal British Navy had ever cried that I could remember in trying situations. The carrier, seeing me in this resolution, proposed that my pocket handkerchief should be spread upon the horse's back to dry. I thanked him and assented, and particularly small it looked under those circumstances. I had now leisure to examine the purse. It was a stiff leather purse with a snap, and had 3 bright shillings in it, which Peggotty had evidently polished up with whitening for my greater delight. But its most precious contents were 2 half-crowns folded together in a bit of paper on which was written in my mother's hand, "For Davy, with my love." I was so overcome by this that I asked the carrier to be so good as to reach me my pocket handkerchief again, but he said he thought I had better do without it, and I thought I really had, so I wiped my eyes on my sleeve and stopped myself. For good, too, though, in consequence of my previous emotions, I was still occasionally seized with a stormy sob. After we had jogged on for some little time, I asked the carrier if he was going all the way. "All the way where?" inquired the carrier. "There," I said. "Where's there?" inquired the carrier. "Near London," I said. "Why, that horse," said the carrier, jerking the rein to point him out, "would be deader than pork afore he got over half the ground." "Are you only going to Yarmouth, then?" I asked. "That's about it," said the carrier. "And there I shall take you to the stagecoach, and the stagecoach, that'll take you to, wherever it is." All this was a great deal for the carrier, whose name was Mr. Barkis, to say, he being, as I observed in a former chapter, of a phlegmatic temperament, and not at all conversational. I offered him a cake as a mark of attention, which he ate at one gulp, exactly like an elephant, and which made no more impression on his big face than it would have done on an elephant's. "Did she make him now?" asked Mr. Barkis, always leaning forward in his slouching way on the footboard of the cart with an arm on each knee. "Peggotty, do you mean, sir?" "Ah," said Mr. Barkis. "Her." "Yes, she makes all our pastry, and does all our cooking." "Do she, though?" said Mr. Barkis. He made up his mouth as if to whistle, but he didn't whistle. He sat looking at the horse's ears as if he saw something new there, and sat so for a considerable time. By and by he said, "No sweethearts, I believe." "Sweetmeats, did you say, Mr. Barkis?" For I thought he wanted something else to eat, and had pointedly alluded to that description of refreshment. "Hearts," said Mr. Barkis. "Sweethearts. No person walks with her?" "With Peggotty?" "I said, her." "Oh, no. She never had a sweetheart." "Didn't she, though?" said Mr. Barkis. Again he made up his mouth to whistle, and again he didn't whistle, but sat looking at the horse's ears. "So she makes," said Mr. Barkis, after a long interval of reflection, "all the apple pastries, and does all the cooking, does she?" I replied that such was the fact. "Well, I'll tell you what," said Mr. Barkis. "Perhaps you might be writing to her?" "I shall certainly write to her," I rejoined. "Ah," he said, slowly turning his eyes towards me. "Well, if you was to writing to her, perhaps you'd recollect to say that Barkis was willing, would you?" "That Barkis is willing," I repeated innocently. "Is that all the message?" "Yes," he said, considering. "Yes, Barkis is willing." "But you'll be at Blunderstone again tomorrow, Mr. Barkis," I said, faltering a little at the idea of my being far away from it then, "and could give your own message so much better." As he repudiated this suggestion, however, with a jerk of his head, and once more confirmed his previous request by saying with profound gravity, "Barkis is willing. That's the message." I readily undertook its transmission. While I was waiting for the coach in the hotel at Yarmouth that very afternoon, I procured a sheet of paper and an inkstand and wrote a note to Peggotty, which ran thus: "My dear Peggotty, I have come here safe. Barkis is willing. My love to Mamma. Yours affectionately. P.S. He says he particularly wants you to know Barkis is willing." When I had taken this commission on myself prospectively, Mr. Barkis relapsed into perfect silence, and I, feeling quite worn out by all that had happened lately, lay down on a sack in the cart and fell asleep. I slept soundly until we got to Yarmouth, which was so entirely new and strange to me in the inn-yard to which we drove that I at once abandoned a latent hope I had had of meeting with some of Mr. Peggotty's family there, perhaps even with little Emily herself. The coach was in the yard, shining very much all over, but without any horses to it as yet, and it looked in that state as if nothing was more unlikely than its ever going to London. I was thinking this, and wondering what would ultimately become of my box, which Mr. Barkis had put down on the yard pavement by the pole, he having driven up the yard to turn his cart, and also what would ultimately become of me, when a lady looked out of a bow window where some fowls and joints of meat were hanging up and said, "Is that the little gentleman from Blunderstone?" "Yes, ma'am," I said. "What name?" inquired the lady. "Copperfield, ma'am," I said. "That won't do," returned the lady. "Nobody's dinner is paid for here in that name." "Is it Murdstone, ma'am?" I said. "If you're Master Murdstone," said the lady, "why do you go and give another name first?" I explained to the lady how it was, who then rang a bell and called out, "William, show the coffee-room," upon which a waiter came running out of a kitchen on the opposite side of the yard to show it, and seemed a good deal surprised when he was only to show it to me. It was a large long room with some large maps in it. I doubt if I could have felt much stranger if the maps had been real foreign countries, and I cast away in the middle of them. I felt it was taking a liberty to sit down with my cap in my hand, on the corner of the chair nearest the door, and when the waiter laid a cloth on purpose for me, and put a set of casters on it, I think I must have turned red all over with modesty. He brought me some chops and vegetables, and took the covers off in such a bouncing manner that I was afraid I must have given him some offence. But he greatly relieved my mind by putting a chair for me at the table, and saying very affably, "Now, 6-foot, come on." I thanked him, and took my seat at the board, but found it extremely difficult to handle my knife and fork with anything like dexterity, or to avoid splashing myself with the gravy while he was standing opposite, staring so hard, and making me blush in the most dreadful manner every time I caught his eye. After watching me into the second chop, he said, "There's half a pint of ale for you. Will you have it now?" I thanked him and said yes, upon which he poured it out of a jug into a large tumbler and held it up against the light and made it look beautiful. "My eye," he said, "it seems a good deal, don't it?" "It does seem a good deal," I answered with a smile, for it was quite delightful to me to find him so pleasant. He was a twinkling-eyed, pimple-faced man, with his hair standing upright all over his head, and as he stood with one arm akimbo, holding up the glass to the light with the other hand, he looked quite friendly. "There was a gentleman here yesterday," he said, "a stout gentleman by the name of Topsawyer. Perhaps you know him?" "No," I said, "I don't think—" "In breeches and gaiters, broad-rimmed hat, grey coat, speckled choker," said the waiter. "No," I said bashfully, "I haven't the pleasure." "He came in here," said the waiter, looking at the light through the tumbler. "Ordered a glass of this ale, would order it. I told him not, drank it and fell dead. It was too old for him. It oughtn't to be drawn, that's the fact." I was very much shocked to hear of this melancholy accident, and said I thought I had better have some water. "Well, you see," said the waiter, still looking at the light through the tumbler with one of his eyes shut up, "our people don't like things being ordered and left. It offends them. But I'll drink it if you like. I'm used to it, and use is everything. I don't think it'll hurt me if I throw my head back and take it off quick. Shall I?" I replied that he would much oblige me by drinking it if he thought he could do it safely, but by no means otherwise. When he did throw his head back and take it off quick, I had a horrible fear, I confess, of seeing him meet the fate of the lamented Mr. Topsawyer and fall lifeless on the carpet. But it didn't hurt him. On the contrary, I thought he seemed the fresher for it. "What have we got here?" he said, putting a fork into my dish. "Not chops." "Chops?" I said. "Lord bless my soul!" he exclaimed. "I didn't know they were chops. Why, a chop's the very thing to take off the bad effects of that beer. Ain't it lucky?" So he took a chop by the bone in one hand and a potato in the other, and ate away with a very good appetite, to my extreme satisfaction. He afterwards took another chop, and another potato, and after that another chop and another potato. When we had done, he brought me a pudding, and, having set it before me, seemed to ruminate, and to become absent in his mind for some moments. "How's the pie?" he said, rousing himself. "It's a pudding," I made answer. "Pudding?" he exclaimed. "Why, bless me, so it is. What?" looking at it near. "You don't mean to say it's a battered pudding?" "Yes, it is indeed." "Why, a battered pudding," he said, taking up a tablespoon, "is my favourite pudding. Ain't that lucky? Come on, little 'un, and let's see who'll get most." The waiter certainly got most. He entreated me more than once to come in and win, but what with his tablespoon to my teaspoon, his dispatch to my dispatch, and his appetite to my appetite, I was left far behind at the first mouthful, and had no chance with him. I never saw anyone enjoy a pudding so much, I think, and he laughed when it was all gone, as if his enjoyment of it lasted still. Finding him so very friendly and companionable, it was then that I asked for the pen and ink and paper to write to Peggotty. He not only brought it immediately, but was good enough to look over me while I wrote the letter. When I had finished it, he asked me where I was going to school. I said, "Near London," which was all I knew. "Oh, my eye," he said, looking very low-spirited. "I am sorry for that." "Why?" I asked him. "Oh, Lord," he said, shaking his head. "That's the school where they broke the boy's ribs. 2 ribs. A little boy he was. I should say he was, let me see. How old are you about?" I told him between 8 and 9. "That's just his age," he said. "He was 8 years and 6 months old when they broke his first rib, 8 years and 8 months old when they broke his second, and did for him." I could not disguise from myself or from the waiter that this was an uncomfortable coincidence, and inquired how it was done. His answer was not cheering to my spirits, for it consisted of 2 dismal words, "With whopping." The blowing of the coach horn in the yard was a seasonable diversion which made me get up and hesitatingly inquire in the mingled pride and diffidence of having a purse, which I took out of my pocket, if there were anything to pay. "There's a sheet of letter paper," he returned. "Did you ever buy a sheet of letter paper?" I could not remember that I ever had. "It's dear," he said, "on account of the duty. 3d. That's the way we're taxed in this country. There's nothing else, except the waiter. Never mind the ink, I lose by that." What should I, how much ought I to... What would it be right to pay the waiter, if you please?" I stammered, blushing. "If I hadn't a family, and that family hadn't the cowpox," said the waiter, "I wouldn't take a 6d. If I didn't support a aged parent and a lovely sister," here the waiter was greatly agitated, "I wouldn't take a farthing. If I had a good place and was treated well here, I should beg acceptance of a trifle instead of taking of it. But I live on broken victuals, and I sleep on the coals here." Here the waiter burst into tears. I was very much concerned for his misfortunes, and felt that any recognition short of 9d would be mere brutality and hardness of heart. Therefore I gave him one of my 3 bright shillings, which he received with much humility and veneration, and spun up with his thumb directly afterwards to try the goodness of. It was a little disconcerting to me to find, when I was being helped up behind the coach, that I was supposed to have eaten all the dinner without any assistance. I discovered this from overhearing the lady in the bow window say to the guard, "Take care of that child, George, or he'll burst," and from observing that the women servants who were about the place came out to look and giggle at me as a young phenomenon. My unfortunate friend the waiter, who had quite recovered his spirits, did not appear to be disturbed by this, but joined in the general admiration without being at all confused. If I had any doubt of him, I suppose this half awakened it, but I am inclined to believe that, with the simple confidence of a child, and the natural reliance of a child upon superior years, qualities I am very sorry any children should prematurely change for worldly wisdom, I had no serious mistrust of him on the whole even then. I felt it rather hard, I must own, to be made, without deserving it, the subject of jokes between the coachman and guard, as to the coach drawing heavy behind on account of my sitting there, and as to the greater expediency of my travelling by wagon. The story of my supposed appetite getting wind among the outside passengers, they were merry upon it likewise, and asked me whether I was going to be paid for at school as 2 brothers or 3, and whether I was contracted for, or went upon the regular terms, with other pleasant questions. But the worst of it was that I knew I should be ashamed to eat anything when an opportunity offered, and that, after a rather light dinner, I should remain hungry all night, for I had left my cakes behind at the hotel in my hurry. My apprehensions were realized. When we stopped for supper, I couldn't muster courage to take any, though I should have liked it very much, but sat by the fire and said I didn't want anything. This did not save me from more jokes either, for a husky-voiced gentleman with a rough face, who had been eating out of a sandwich-box nearly all the way, except when he had been drinking out of a bottle, said I was like a boa constrictor who took enough at one meal to last him a long time, after which he actually brought a rash out upon himself with boiled beef. We had started from Yarmouth at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and we were due in London about 8 next morning. It was midsummer weather, and the evening was very pleasant. When we passed through a village, I pictured to myself what the insides of the houses were like, and what the inhabitants were about, and when boys came running after us and got up behind and swung there for a little way, I wondered whether their fathers were alive, and whether they were happy at home. I had plenty to think of, therefore, besides my mind running continually on the kind of place I was going to, which was an awful speculation. Sometimes, I remember, I resigned myself to thoughts of home and Peggotty, and to endeavouring in a confused blind way to recall how I had felt, and what sort of boy I used to be before I bit Mr. Murdstone, which I couldn't satisfy myself about by any means. I seemed to have bitten him in such a remote antiquity. The night was not so pleasant as the evening, for it got chilly, and being put between 2 gentlemen, the rough-faced one and another, to prevent my tumbling off the coach, I was nearly smothered by their falling asleep, and completely blocking me up. They squeezed me so hard sometimes that I could not help crying out, "Oh, if you please," which they didn't like at all because it woke them. Opposite me was an elderly lady in a great fur coat, who looked in the dark more like a haystack than a lady, she was wrapped up to such a degree. This lady had a basket with her, and she hadn't known what to do with it for a long time, until she found that on account of my legs being short, it could go underneath me. It cramped and hurt me so that it made me perfectly miserable, but if I moved in the least and made a glass that was in the basket rattle against something else, as it was sure to do, she gave me the cruellest poke with her foot and said, "Come, don't you fidget. Your bones are young enough, I'm sure." At last the sun rose, and then my companions seemed to sleep easier. The difficulties under which they had laboured all night, and which had found utterance in the most terrific gasps and snorts, are not to be conceived. As the sun got higher, their sleep became lighter, and so they gradually, one by one, awoke. I recollect being very much surprised by the feint everybody made then of not having been to sleep at all, and by the uncommon indignation with which everyone repelled the charge. I labour under the same kind of astonishment to this day, having invariably observed that, of all human weaknesses, the one to which our common nature is the least disposed to confess, I cannot imagine why, is the weakness of having gone to sleep in a coach. What an amazing place London was to me when I saw it in the distance, and how I believed all the adventures of all my favourite heroes to be constantly enacting and reenacting there, and how I vaguely made it out in my own mind to be fuller of wonders and wickedness than all the cities of the earth. I need not stop here to relate. We approached it by degrees, and got in due time to the inn in the Whitechapel district for which we were bound. I forgot whether it was the Blue Bull or the Blue Boar, but I know it was the Blue something, and that its likeness was painted up on the back of the coach. The guard's eye lighted on me as he was getting down, and he said at the booking-office door, "Is there anybody here for a youngster booked in the name of Murdstone from Blunderstone, Suffolk, to be left till called for?" Nobody answered. "Try Copperfield, if you please, sir," said I, looking helplessly down. "Is there anybody here for a youngster booked in the name of Murdstone from Blunderstone, Suffolk, but owing to the name of Copperfield, to be left till called for?" said the guard. "Come, is there anybody?" No, there was nobody. I looked anxiously around, but the inquiry made no impression on any of the bystanders, if I except a man in gaiters with one eye, who suggested that they had better put a brass collar round my neck and tie me up in the stable. A ladder was brought, and I got down after the lady, who was like a haystack, not daring to stir until her basket was removed. The coach was cleared of passengers by that time. The luggage was very soon cleared out. The horses had been taken out before the luggage, and now the coach itself was wheeled and backed off by some hostlers out of the way. Still, nobody appeared to claim the dusty youngster from Blunderstone, Suffolk. More solitary than Robinson Crusoe, who had nobody to look at him and see that he was solitary, I went into the booking office and, by invitation of the clerk on duty, passed behind the counter and sat down on the scale at which they weighed the luggage. Here, as I sat looking at the parcels, packages, and books, and inhaling the smell of stables, ever since associated with that morning, a procession of most tremendous considerations began to march through my mind. Supposing nobody should ever fetch me, how long would they consent to keep me there? Would they keep me long enough to spend 7 shillings? Should I sleep at night in one of those wooden bins with the other luggage, and wash myself at the pump in the yard in the morning? Or should I be turned out every night and expected to come again to be left till called for when the office opened next day? Supposing there was no mistake in the case, and Mr. Murdstone had devised this plan to get rid of me, what should I do? If they allowed me to remain there until my 7 shillings were spent, I couldn't hope to remain there when I began to starve. That would obviously be inconvenient and unpleasant to the customers, besides entailing on the Blue, whatever it was, the risk of funeral expenses. If I started off at once and tried to walk back home, how could I ever find my way? How could I ever hope to walk so far? How could I make sure of anyone but Peggotty even if I got back? If I found out the nearest proper authorities and offered myself to go for a soldier or a sailor, I was such a little fellow that it was most likely they wouldn't take me in. These thoughts and 100 other such thoughts turned me burning hot and made me giddy with apprehension and dismay. I was in the height of my fever when a man entered and whispered to the clerk, who presently slanted me off the scale and pushed me over to him as if I were weighed, bought, delivered, and paid for. As I went out of the office hand in hand with this new acquaintance, I stole a look at him. He was a gaunt, sallow young man with hollow cheeks and a chin almost as black as Mr. Murdstone's. But there the likeness ended, for his whiskers were shaved off, and his hair, instead of being glossy, was rusty and dry. He was dressed in a suit of black clothes, which were rather rusty and dry too, and rather short on the sleeves and legs, and he had a white neckerchief on that was not over clean. I did not and do not suppose that this neckerchief was all the linen he wore, but it was all he allowed or gave any hint of. "You're the new boy?" he said. "Yes, sir," I said. I supposed I was. I didn't know. "I'm one of the masters at Salem House," he said. I made him a bow and felt very much overawed. I was so ashamed to allude to a commonplace thing like my box to a scholar and a master at Salem House that we had gone some little distance from the yard before I had the hardihood to mention it. We turned back on my humbly insinuating that it might be useful to me hereafter, and he told the clerk that the carrier had instructions to call for it at noon. "If you please, sir," I said, when we had accomplished about the same distance as before. "Is it far?" "It's down by Blackheath," he said. "Is that far, sir?" I diffidently asked. "It's a good step," he said. "We shall go by the stagecoach. It's about 6 miles. I was so faint and tired that the idea of holding out for 6 miles more was too much for me. I took heart to tell him that I had had nothing all night, and that if he would allow me to buy something to eat I should be very obliged to him. He appeared surprised at this. I see him stop and looking at me now, and after considering for a few moments said he wanted to call on an old person who lived not far off, and that the best way would be for me to buy some bread, or whatever I liked best that was wholesome, and make my breakfast at her house, where we could get some milk. Accordingly, we looked in at a baker's window, and after I made a series of proposals to buy everything that was bilious in the shop, and he had rejected them one by one, we decided in favour of a nice little loaf of brown bread which cost me 3d. Then, at a grocer's shop, we bought an egg and a slice of streaky bacon, which still left what I thought a good deal of change out of the second of the bright shillings, and made me consider London a very cheap place. These provisions laid in, we went on through a great noise and uproar that confused my weary head beyond description, and over a bridge which no doubt was London Bridge. Indeed, I think he told me so, but I was half asleep, until we came to the poor person's house, which was a part of some almshouses, as I knew by their look, and by an inscription on a stone over the gate, which said they were established for 25 poor women. The master at Salem House lifted the latch of one of a number of little black doors that were all alike, and had each a little diamond-paned window on one side, and another little diamond-paned window above, and we went into the little house of one of these poor old women, who was blowing a fire to make a little saucepan boil. On seeing the master enter, the old woman stopped with the bellows on her knee, and said something that I thought sounded like, "My Charlie," but on seeing me come in too, she got up and, rubbing her hands, made a confused sort of half-curtsy. "Can you cook this young gentleman's breakfast for him, if you please?" said the master at Salem House. "Can I?" said the old woman. "Yes, can I, sure." "How's Mrs. Fibbitson today?" said the master, looking at another old woman in a large chair by the fire, who was such a bundle of clothes that I feel grateful to this hour for not having sat upon her by mistake. "Ah, she's poorly," said the first old woman. "It's one of her bad days. If the fire was to go out through any accident, I verily believe she'd go out too, and never come to life again." As they looked at her, I looked at her also. Although it was a warm day, she seemed to think of nothing but the fire. I fancied she was jealous even of the saucepan on it, and I have reason to know that she took its impressment into the service of boiling my egg and broiling my bacon in dudgeon, for I saw her with my own discomforted eyes shake her fist at me once when those culinary operations were going on and no one else was looking. The sun streamed in at the little window, but she sat with her own back and the back of the large chair towards it, screening the fire as if she were sedulously keeping it warm instead of it keeping her warm, and watching it in a most distrustful manner. The completion of the preparations for my breakfast by relieving the fire gave her such extreme joy that she laughed aloud, and a very unmelodious laugh she had, I must say. I sat down to my brown loaf, my egg, and my rasher of bacon, with a basin of milk besides, and made a most delicious meal. While I was yet in full enjoyment of it, the old woman of the house said to the master, "Have you got your flute with you?" "Yes," he returned. "Have a blow at it," said the old woman coaxingly. "Do." The master, upon this, put his hand underneath the skirts of his coat, and brought out his flute in 3 pieces, which he screwed together, and began immediately to play. My impression is, after many years of consideration, that there never can have been anybody in the world who played worse. He made the most dismal sounds I have ever heard produced by any means natural or artificial. I don't know what the tunes were, if there were such things in the performance at all, which I doubt, but the influence of the strain upon me was, first, to make me think of all my sorrows until I could hardly keep my tears back, then to take away my appetite, and lastly, to make me so sleepy that I couldn't keep my eyes open. They began to close again, and I began to nod, as the recollection rises fresh upon me. Once more the little room, with its open corner cupboard, and its square-backed chairs, and its angular little staircase leading to the room above, and its 3 peacock's feathers displayed over the mantelpiece. I remember wondering, when I first went in, what that peacock would have thought if he had known what his finery was doomed to come to, fades from before me, and I nod and sleep. The flute becomes inaudible, the wheels of the coach are heard instead, and I am on my journey. The coach jolts, I wake with a start, and the flute has come back again, and the master at Salem House is sitting with his legs crossed, playing it dolefully, while the old woman of the house looks on delighted. She fades in her turn, and he fades, and all fades, and there is no flute, no master, no Salem House, no David Copperfield, no anything but heavy sleep. I dreamed, I thought, that once while he was blowing into this dismal flute, the old woman of the house, who had gone nearer and nearer to him in her ecstatic admiration, leaned over the back of his chair and gave him an affectionate squeeze around the neck, which stopped his playing for a moment. I was in the middle state between sleeping and waking, either then or immediately afterwards, for, as he resumed, it was a real fact that he had stopped playing, I saw and heard the same old woman ask Mrs. Fibbitson if it wasn't delicious, meaning the flute, to which Mrs. Fibbitson replied, "Aye, yes," and nodded at the fire, to which I am persuaded she gave the credit of the whole performance. When I seemed to have been dozing a long while, the master at Salem House unscrewed his flute into the 3 pieces, put them up as before, and took me away. We found the coach very near at hand, and got upon the roof. But I was so dead sleepy that when we stopped on the road to take up somebody else, they put me inside where there were no passengers, and where I slept profoundly, until I found the coach going at a foot-pace up a steep hill among green leaves. Presently it stopped, and had come to its destination. A short walk brought us, I mean the master and me, to Salem House, which was enclosed with a high brick wall, and looked very dull. Over a door in this wall was a board with Salem House upon it, and through a grating in this door we were surveyed when we rang the bell by a surly face, which I found, on the door being opened, belonged to a stout man with a bull neck, a wooden leg, overhanging temples, and his hair cut close all around his head. "The new boy," said the master. The man with the wooden leg eyed me all over, but it didn't take long, for there was not much of me, and locked the gate behind us, and took out the key. We were going up to the house among some dark heavy trees, when he called after my conductor, "Hello!" We looked back, and he was standing at the door of a little lodge where he lived, with a pair of boots in his hand. "Here, the cobbler's been," he said, "since you've been out, Mr. Mell, and he says he can't mend 'em any more. He says there ain't a bit of the original boot left, and he wonders you expect it." With these words he threw the boots toward Mr. Mell, who went back a few paces to pick them up, and looked at them, very disconsolately, I was afraid, as we went on together. I observed then, for the first time, that the boots he had on were a good deal the worse for wear, and that his stocking was just breaking out in one place like a bud. Salem House was a square brick building with wings, of a bare and unfurnished appearance. All about it was so very quiet that I said to Mr. Mell I supposed the boys were out. But he seemed surprised at my not knowing that it was holiday time, that all the boys were at their several homes, that Mr. Creakle, the proprietor, was down by the seaside with Mrs. and Miss Creakle, and that I was sent in holiday time as a punishment for my misdoing, all of which he explained to me as we went along. I gazed upon the schoolroom into which he took me, as the most forlorn and desolate place I had ever seen. I see it now. A long room, with 3 long rows of desks, and 6 of forms, and bristling all around with pegs for hats and slates. Scraps of old copybooks and exercises litter the dirty floor. Some silkworms' houses made of the same materials are scattered over the desks. 2 miserable little white mice left behind by their owner are running up and down in a fusty castle made of pasteboard and wire, looking in all the corners with their red eyes for anything to eat. A bird in a cage, very little bigger than himself, makes a mournful rattle now and then in hopping on his perch, 2 inches high, or dropping from it, but neither sings nor chirps. There is a strange unwholesome smell upon the room, like mildewed corduroys, sweet apples wanting air, and rotten books. There could not well be more ink splashed about it if it had been roofless from its first construction, and the skies had rained, snowed, hailed, and blown ink through the varying seasons of the year. Mr. Mell, having left me while he took his irreparable boots upstairs, I went softly to the upper end of the room, observing all this as I crept along. Suddenly I came upon a pasteboard placard, beautifully written, which was lying on the desk, and bore these words, "Take care of him. He bites." I got upon the desk immediately, apprehensive of at least a great dog underneath. But though I looked all around with anxious eyes, I could see nothing of him. I was still engaged in peering about when Mr. Mell came back and asked me what I did up there. "I beg your pardon, sir," says I, "if you please. I'm looking for the dog." "Dog?" he says. "What dog? Isn't it a dog, sir?" "Isn't what a dog?" "That's to be taken care of, sir, that bites." "No, Copperfield," says he gravely, "that's not a dog. That's a boy. My instructions are, Copperfield, to put this placard on your back. I am sorry to make such a beginning with you, but I must do it." With that he took me down, and tied the placard, which was neatly constructed for the purpose, on my shoulders like a knapsack, and wherever I went afterwards I had the consolation of carrying it. What I suffered from that placard nobody can imagine. Whether it was possible for people to see me or not, I always fancied that somebody was reading it. It was no relief to turn round and find nobody, for wherever my back was, there I imagined somebody always to be. That cruel man with the wooden leg aggravated my sufferings. He was in authority, and if he ever saw me leaning against a tree or a wall or the house, he roared out from his lodge door in a stupendous voice, "Hallo, you, sir! You, Copperfield! Show that badge conspicuous, or I'll report you." The playground was a bare gravelled yard, open to all the back of the house and the offices, and I knew that the servants read it, and the butcher read it, and the baker read it, that everybody, in a word, who came backwards and forwards to the house of a morning when I was ordered to walk there, read that I was to be taken care of, for I bit. I recollect that I positively began to have a dread of myself as a kind of wild boy who did bite. There was an old door in this playground on which the boys had a custom of carving their names. It was completely covered with such inscriptions. In my dread of the end of the vacation and their coming back, I could not read a boy's name without inquiring in what tone and with what emphasis he would read, "Take care of him, he bites." There was one boy, a certain J. Steerforth, who cut his name very deep and very often, who, I conceived, would read it in a rather strong voice, and afterwards pull my hair. There was another boy, one Tommy Traddles, who I dreaded would make game of it, and pretend to be dreadfully frightened of me. There was a third, George Demple, who I fancied would sing it. I have looked a little shrinking creature at that door until the owners of all the names, there were 45 of them in the school then, Mr. Mell said, seemed to send me to Coventry by general acclamation, and to cry out, each in his own way, "Take care of him, he bites." It was the same with the places at the desks and forms. It was the same with the groves of deserted bedsteads. I peeped at on my way to, and when I was, in my own bed. I remember dreaming night after night of being with my mother as she used to be, or of going to a party at Mr. Peggotty's, or of travelling outside the stagecoach, or of dining again with my unfortunate friend the waiter, and in all these circumstances making people scream and stare by the unhappy disclosure that I had nothing on but my little nightshirt and that placard. In the monotony of my life, and in my constant apprehension of the reopening of the school, it was such an insupportable affliction. I had long tasks every day to do with Mr. Mell, but I did them, there being no Mr. and Miss Murdstone here, and got through them without disgrace. Before and after them I walked about, supervised, as I have mentioned, by the man with the wooden leg. How vividly I called to mind the damp about the house, the green, cracked flagstones in the court, an old leaky water-butt, and the discoloured trunks of some of the grim trees which seemed to have dripped more in the rain than other trees, and to have blown less in the sun. At 1 we dined, Mr. Mell and I, at the upper end of the long bare dining-room full of deal tables, and smelling of fat. Then we had more tasks until tea, which Mr. Mell drank out of a blue teacup, and I out of a tin pot. All day long, and until 7 or 8 in the evening, Mr. Mell, at his own detached desk in the schoolroom, worked hard with pen, ink, ruler, books, and writing, making out the bills, as I found, for last half a year. When he had put up his things for the night, he took out his flute and blew at it, until I almost thought he would gradually blow his whole being into the large hole at the top, and ooze away at the keys. I picture my small self in the dimly lighted rooms, sitting with my head upon my hand, listening to the doleful performance of Mr. Mell, and conning tomorrow's lessons. I picture myself with my book shut up, to listening to the doleful performance of Mr. Mell, and listening through it to what used to be at home, and to the blowing of the wind on Yarmouth flats, and feeling very sad and solitary. I picture myself going up to bed among the unused rooms, and sitting on my bedside crying for a comfortable word from Peggotty. I picture myself coming downstairs in the morning, and looking through a long ghastly gash of a staircase window at the school bell hanging on the top of an outhouse with a weathercock above it, and dreading the time when it shall ring J. Steerforth and the rest to work, which is only second in my foreboding apprehensions to the time when the man with the wooden leg shall unlock the rusty gate to give admission to the awful Mr. Creakle. I cannot think I was a very dangerous character in any of these aspects, but in all of them I carried the same warning on my back. Mr. Mell never said much to me, but he was never harsh to me. I suppose we were company to each other, without talking. I forgot to mention that he would talk to himself sometimes, and grin, and clench his fist, and grind his teeth, and pull his hair in an unaccountable manner. But he had these peculiarities, and at first they frightened me, though I soon got used to them. The end of Chapter 5 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Read by Rick Kishner for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu.